Book 2, Chapter 10 of Les Misérables, translated by Isabel F. Hapgood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Garrett Fitzgerald. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 2, The Fall. Chapter 10, The Man Aroused. As the cathedral clock struck 2 in the morning, Jean Valjean awoke. What woke him was that his bed was too good. It was nearly 20 years since he had slept in a bed, and, although he had not undressed, the sensation was too novel not to disturb his slumbers. He had slept more than 4 hours. His fatigue had passed away. He was accustomed not to devote many hours to repose. He opened his eyes and stared into the gloom which surrounded him. Then he closed them again with the intention of going to sleep once more. When many varied sensations have agitated the day, when various matters preoccupy the mind, one falls asleep once, but not a second time. Sleep comes more easily than it returns. This is what happened to Jean Valjean. He could not get to sleep again, and he fell to thinking. He was at one of those moments when the thoughts which one has in one's mind are troubled. There was a sort of dark confusion in his brain. His memories of the olden time and of the immediate present floated there pell-mell and mingled confusedly, losing their proper forms, becoming disproportionately large, then suddenly disappearing, as in a muddy and perturbed pool. Many thoughts occurred to him, but there was one which kept constantly presenting itself afresh, and which drove away all others. We will mention this thought at once. He had observed the 6 sets of silver forks and spoons, and the ladle, which Madame Magloire had placed on the table. Those 6 sets of silver haunted him. They were there, a few paces distant. Just as he was traversing the adjoining room to reach the one in which he then was, the old servant woman had been in the act of placing them in a little cupboard near the head of the bed. He had taken careful note of this cupboard. On the right, as you entered from the dining room, they were solid and old silver. From the ladle one could get at least 200 francs. Double what he had earned in 19 years. It is true that he would have earned more if the administration had not robbed him. His mind wavered for a whole hour in fluctuations with which there was certainly mingled some struggle. 3 o'clock struck. He opened his eyes again, drew himself up abruptly into a sitting posture, stretched out his arm and felt of his knapsack, which he had thrown down on a corner of the alcove. Then he hung his legs over the edge of the bed, and placed his feet on the floor, and thus found himself, almost without knowing it, seated on his bed. He remained for a time thoughtfully in this attitude, which would have been suggestive of something sinister for anyone who had seen him thus in the dark, the only person awake in that house where all was sleeping. All of a sudden he stooped down, removed his shoes, and placed them softly on the mat beside the bed. Then he resumed his thoughtful attitude, and became motionless once more. Throughout this hideous meditation, the thoughts which we have above indicated moved incessantly through his brain, entered, withdrew, re-entered, and in a manner oppressed him. And then he thought, also, without knowing why, and with the mechanical persistence of reverie, of a convict named Brevet, whom he had known in the galleys, and whose trousers had been upheld by a single suspender of knitted cotton. The checkered pattern of that suspender recurred incessantly to his mind. He remained in this situation, and would have so remained indefinitely, even until daybreak, had not the clock struck 1, the half or quarter hour. It seemed to him that stroke said to him, "Come on." He rose to his feet, hesitated still another moment, and listened. All was quiet in the house. Then he walked straight ahead, with short steps, to the window, of which he caught a glimpse. The night was not very dark. There was a full moon, across which coursed large clouds driven by the wind. This created outdoors alternate shadow and gleams of light, eclipses, then bright openings of the clouds, and indoors a sort of twilight. This twilight, sufficient to enable a person to see his way, intermittent on account of the clouds, resembled the sort of livid light which falls through an air-hole in a cellar, before which the passer-by come and go. On arriving at the window, Jean Valjean examined it. It had no grating. It opened in the garden, and was fastened, according to the fashion of the country, only by a small pin. He opened it, but as a rush of cold and piercing air penetrated the room abruptly, he closed it again immediately. He scrutinized the garden with that attentive gaze which studies rather than looks. The garden was enclosed by a tolerably low white wall, easy to climb. Far away, at the extremity, he perceived tops of trees, spaced at regular intervals, which indicated that the wall separated the garden from an avenue or lane planted with trees. Having taken this survey, he executed a movement like that of a man who has made up his mind, strode to his alcove, grasped his knapsack, opened it, fumbled in it, pulled out of it something which he placed on the bed, put his shoes into one of his pockets, shut the whole thing up again, threw the knapsack on his shoulders, put on his cap, drew the visor down over his eyes, felt for his cudgel, went and placed it in the angle of the window, then returned to the bed, and resolutely seized the object which he had deposited there. It resembled a short bar of iron, pointed like a pike at one end. It would have been difficult to distinguish in that darkness for what employment that bit of iron could have been designed. Perhaps it was a lever, possibly it was a club. In the daytime it would have been possible to recognize it as nothing more than a miner's candlestick. Convicts were, at that period, sometimes employed in quarrying stone from the lofty hills which environed Toulon, and it was not rare for them to have miners' tools at their command. These miners' candlesticks are of massive iron, terminated at the lower extremity by a point, by means of which they are stuck into the rock. He took the candlestick in his right hand. Holding his breath and trying to deaden the sound of his tread, he directed his steps to the door of the adjoining room, occupied by the bishop, as we already know. On arriving at this door, he found it ajar. The bishop had not closed it. End of Book 2, Chapter 10. Recording by Garrett Fitzgerald, Brewer, Maine.
Recording by Betty Greeby in Wapella, Illinois. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 2, Chapter 11. What he does. Jean Valjean listened, not a sound. He gave the door a push. He pushed it gently with the tip of his finger, lightly, with the furtive and uneasy gentleness of a cat which is desirous of entering. The door yielded to this pressure, and made an imperceptible and silent movement, which enlarged the opening a little. He waited a moment, then gave the door a second and a bolder push. It continued to yield in silence. The opening was now large enough to allow him to pass, but near the door there stood a little table, which formed an embarrassing angle with it, and barred the entrance. Jean Valjean recognized the difficulty. It was necessary, at any cost, to enlarge the aperture still further. He decided on his course of action, and gave the door a third push, more energetic than the two preceding. This time a badly oiled hinge suddenly emitted amid the silence a hoarse and prolonged cry. Jean Valjean shuddered. The noise of the hinge rang in his ears with something of the piercing and formidable sound of the trumpet of the day of judgment. In the fantastic exaggerations of the first moment he almost imagined that the hinge had just become animated, and had suddenly assumed a terrible life, and that it was barking like a dog to arouse every one, and warn and to wake those who were asleep. He halted shuddering, bewildered, and fell back from the tips of his toes upon his heels. He heard the arteries in his temples beating like two forge hammers, and it seemed to him that his breath issued from his breast with the roar of the wind issuing from a cavern. It seemed impossible to him that the horrible clamor of that irritated hinge should not have disturbed the entire household. Like the shock of an earthquake, the door, pushed by him, had taken the alarm, and had shouted. The old man would rise at once. The two old women would shriek out. People would come to their assistance. In less than a quarter of an hour the town would be in an uproar, and the gendarmerie on hand. For a moment he thought himself lost. He remained where he was, petrified like the statue of salt, not daring to make a movement. Several minutes elapsed. The door had fallen wide open. He ventured to peep into the next room. Nothing had stirred there. He lent an ear. Nothing was moving in the house. The noise made by the rusty hinge had not awakened any one. This first danger was past, but there still reigned a frightful tumult within him. Nevertheless, he did not retreat. Even when he had thought himself lost, he had not drawn back. His only thought now was to finish as soon as possible. He took a step and entered the room. This room was in a state of perfect calm. Here and there vague and confused forms were distinguishable, which in the daylight were papers scattered on a table, open folios, volumes piled upon a stool, an armchair heaped with clothing, a prie-dieu, and which at that hour were only shadowy corners and whitish spots. Jean Valjean advanced with precaution, taking care not to knock against the furniture. He could hear at the extremity of the room the even and tranquil breathing of the sleeping bishop. He suddenly came to a halt. He was near the bed. He had arrived there sooner than he had thought for. Nature sometimes mingles her effects and her spectacles with our actions, with sombre and intelligent appropriateness, as though she desired to make us reflect. For the last half-hour a large cloud had covered the heavens. At that moment, when Jean Valjean paused in front of the bed, this cloud parted, as though on purpose, and a ray of light, traversing the long window, suddenly illuminated the bishop's pale face. He was sleeping peacefully. He lay in his bed almost completely dressed, on account of the cold of the Basses Alps, in a garment of brown wool, in which covered his arms to the wrists. His head was thrown back on the pillow in the careless attitude of repose. His hand, adorned with the pastoral ring, and whence had fallen so many good deeds and so many holy actions, was hanging over the edge of the bed. His whole face was illumined with a vague expression of satisfaction, of hope, and of felicity. It was more than a smile, and almost a radiance. He bore upon his brow the indescribable reflection of a light which was invisible. The soul of the just contemplates in sleep a mysterious heaven. A reflection of that heaven rested on the bishop. It was at the same time a luminous transparency, for that heaven was within him, that heaven was his conscience. At the moment when the ray of moonlight superposed itself, so to speak, upon that inward radiance, the sleeping bishop seemed as in a glory. It remained, however, gentle and veiled in an ineffable half-light. That moon in the sky, that slumbering nature, that garden without a quiver, that house which was so calm, the hour, the moment, the silence, added some solemn and unspeakable quality to the venerable repose of this man, and enveloped in a sort of serene and majestic aureole of white hair, those closed eyes, that face in which all was hope and all was confidence, that head of an old man and that slumber of an infant. There was something almost divine in this man, who was thus august without being himself aware of it. Jean Valjean was in the shadow, and stood motionless, with his iron candlestick in his hand, frightened by this luminous old man. Never had he beheld anything like this. This confidence terrified him. The moral world has no grander spectacle than this. A troubled and uneasy conscience, which has arrived on the brink of an evil action, contemplating the slumber of the just. That slumber, in that isolation, and with a neighbor like himself, had about it something sublime, of which he was vaguely but imperiously conscious. No one could have told what was passing within him, not even himself. In order to attempt to form an idea of it, it is necessary to think of the most violent of things in the presence of the most gentle. Even on his visage it would have been impossible to distinguish anything with certainty. It was a sort of haggard astonishment. He gazed at it, and that was all. But what was his thought? It would have been impossible to divine it. What was evident was that he had been touched and astounded. But what was the nature of this emotion? His eye never quitted the old man. The only thing which was clearly to be inferred from his attitude and his physiognomy was a strange indecision. One would have said that he was hesitating between the two abysses, the one in which one loses oneself, and that in which one saves oneself. He seemed prepared to crush that skull or kiss that hand. At the expiration of a few minutes his left arm rose slowly towards his brow, and he took off his cap. Then his arm fell back with the same deliberation, and Jean Valjean fell to meditating once more. His cap in his left hand, his club in his right hand, his hair bristling all over his savage head. The bishop continued to sleep in profound peace beneath that terrifying gaze. The gleam of the moon rendered confusedly visible the crucifix over the chimney-piece, which seemed to be extending its arms to both of them, with a benediction for one and pardon for the other. Suddenly Jean Valjean replaced his cap on his brow, then stepped rapidly past the bed, without glancing at the bishop, straight to the cupboard, which he saw near the head. He raised his iron candlestick as though to force the lock. The key was there. He opened it. The first thing which presented itself to him was the basket of silverware. He seized it, traversed the chamber with long strides, without taking any precautions, and without troubling himself at the noise, gained the door, re-entered the oratory, opened the window, seized his cudgel, bestrode the window-sill of the ground floor, put the silver into his knapsack, threw away the basket, crossed the garden, leaped over the wall like a tiger, and fled. End of Book 2, Chapter 11 of Les Misérables, by Victor Hugo. Recording by Betty Grebe in Wapella, Illinois. By Betty Grebe in Wapella, Illinois. Les Misérables, by Victor Hugo. Book 2, Chapter 12. The Bishop Works. The next morning at sunrise, Monseigneur Bienvenu was strolling in his garden. Madame Magloire ran up to him in utter consternation. "Monseigneur, Monseigneur!" she exclaimed, "does your Grace know where the basket of silver is?" "Yes," replied the bishop. "Jesus the Lord be praised!" she resumed. "I did not know what had become of it." The bishop had just picked up the basket in a flower-bed. He presented it to Madame Magloire. "Here it is." "Well," said she, "nothing in it. And the silver?" "Ah," returned the bishop, "so it is the silver which troubles you. I don't know where it is." "Great good God! It is stolen! That man who was here last night has stolen it!" In a twinkling, with all the vivacity of an alert old woman, Madame Magloire had rushed to the oratory, entered the alcove, and returned to the bishop. The bishop had just bent down, and was sighing as he examined a plant of Cochlearia de Guion, which the basket had broken as it fell across the bed. He rose up at Madame Magloire's cry. "Monseigneur, the man is gone! The silver has been stolen!" As she uttered this exclamation, her eyes fell upon a corner of the garden, where traces of the wall having been scaled were visible. The coping of the wall had been torn away. "Stay! Yonder is the way he went. He jumped over into Cochefilet Lane. Ah, the abomination! He has stolen our silver!" The bishop remained silent for a moment. Then he raised his grave eyes, and said gently to Madame Magloire, "And in the first place, was that silver ours?" Madame Magloire was speechless. Another silence ensued. Then the bishop went on. "Madame Magloire, I have for a long time detained that silver wrongfully. It belonged to the poor." "Who was that man?" "A poor man, evidently." "Alas, Jesus!" returned Madame Magloire, "it is not for my sake, nor for Mademoiselle's. It makes no difference to us, but it is for the sake of Monseigneur. What is Monseigneur to eat with now?" The bishop gazed at her with an air of amazement. "Ah, come, are there no such things as pewter forks and spoons?" Madame Magloire shrugged her shoulders. "Pewter has an odor." "Iron forks and spoons, then." Madame Magloire made an expressive grimace. "Iron has a taste." "Very well," said the bishop. "Wooden ones, then." A few moments later, as he was breakfasting at the very table at which Jean Valjean had sat on the previous evening. As he ate his breakfast, Monseigneur Welcome remarked gaily to his sister, who said nothing, and to Madame Magloire, who was grumbling under her breath, that one really does not need either fork or spoon, even of wood, in order to dip a bit of bread in a cup of milk. "A pretty idea, truly," said Madame Magloire to herself as she came and went. "To take a man in like that, and to lodge him close to oneself, and how fortunate that he did nothing but steal. Ah, mon Dieu, it makes one shudder to think of it." As the brother and sister were about to rise from the table, there came a knock at the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened. A singular and violent group made its appearance on the threshold. 3 men were holding a 4th man by the collar. The 3 men were gendarmes d'armes. The other was Jean Valjean. A brigadier of gendarmes, who seemed to be in command of the group, was standing near the door. He entered and advanced to the bishop, making a military salute. "Monseigneur," said he. At this word, Jean Valjean, who was dejected and seemed overwhelmed, raised his head with an air of stupefaction. "Monseigneur," he murmured, "so he is not the curé." "Silence!" said the gendarme. "He is the Monseigneur the Bishop." In the meantime, Monseigneur Bienvenu had advanced as quickly as his great age permitted. "Ah, here you are!" he exclaimed, looking at Jean Valjean. "I am glad to see you. Well, but how is this? I gave you the candlesticks too, which are of silver like the rest, and for which you can certainly get 200 francs. Why did you not carry them away with your forks and spoons?" Jean Valjean opened his eyes wide, and stared at the venerable bishop with an expression which no human tongue can render any account of. "Monseigneur," said the brigadier of gendarmes, "so what this man said is true, then? We came across him. He was walking like a man who is running away. We stopped him to look into the matter. He had the silver." "And he told you," interposed the bishop with a smile, "that it had been given him by a kind old fellow of a priest with whom he had passed the night? I see how the matter stands, and you have brought him back here. It is a mistake." "In that case," replied the brigadier, "we can let him go?" "Certainly," replied the bishop. The gendarme released Jean Valjean, who recoiled. "Is it true that I am to be released?" he said, in an almost inarticulate voice, and as though he were talking in his sleep. "Yes, thou art released. Dost thou not understand?" said one of the gendarmes. "My friend," resumed the bishop, "before you go, here are your candlesticks. Take them." He stepped to the chimney-piece, took the 2 silver candlesticks, and brought them to Jean Valjean. The 2 women looked on without uttering a word, without a gesture, without a look which could disconcert the bishop. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically and with a bewildered air. "Now," said the bishop, "go in peace. By the way, when you return, my friend, it is not necessary to pass through the garden. You can always enter and depart through the street door. It is never fastened with anything but a latch, either by day or by night." Then returning to the gendarmes, "You may retire, gentlemen." The gendarmes retired. Jean Valjean was like a man on the point of fainting. The bishop drew near to him, and said in a low voice, "Do not forget, never forget, that you have promised to use this money in becoming an honest man." Jean Valjean, who had no recollection of ever having promised anything, remained speechless. The bishop had emphasized the words when he uttered them. He resumed with solemnity, "Jean Valjean, my brother, you are no longer belong to evil, but to good. It is your soul that I buy from you. I withdraw it from black thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God." End of Book 2, Chapter 12 of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Recording by Betty Greeby in Wapella, Illinois.
.org. Recorded by John Bailey. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabelle F. Hapgood. Book 2, Chapter 13. Little Gervais. Jean Valjean left the town as though he were fleeing from it. He set out at a very hasty pace through the fields, taking whatever roads and paths presented themselves to him, without perceiving that he was incessantly retracing his steps. He wandered thus the whole morning without having eaten anything, and without feeling hungry. He was the prey of a throng of novel sensations. He was conscious of a sort of rage. He did not know against whom it was directed. He could not have told whether he was touched or humiliated. There came over him at moments a strange emotion which he resisted, and to which he opposed the hardness acquired during the last 20 years of his life. This state of mind fatigued him. He perceived with dismay that the sort of frightful calm which the injustice of his misfortune had conferred upon him was giving way within him. He asked himself what would replace this. At times he would have actually preferred to be in prison with a gendarme, and that things should not have happened in this way. It would have agitated him less. Although the season was tolerably far advanced, there were still a few late flowers in the hedgerows here and there, whose odor as he passed through them in his march recalled to him memories of his childhood. These memories were almost intolerable to him, it was so long since they had recurred to him. Unutterable thoughts assembled within him in this manner all day long. As the sun declined to its setting, casting long shadows athwart the soil from every pebble, Jean Valjean sat down behind a bush upon a large ruddy plain, which was absolutely deserted. There was nothing on the horizon except the Alps, not even the spire of a distant village. Jean Valjean might have been 3 leagues distant from D. A path which intersected the plains passed a few paces from the bush. In the middle of this meditation, which would have contributed not a little to render his rags terrifying to anyone who might have encountered him, a joyous sound became audible. He turned his head and saw a little Savoyard, about 10 years of age, coming up the path and singing, his hurdy-gurdy on his hip and his marmot box on his back. One of those gay and gentle children who go from land to land, affording a view of their knees through the holes in their trousers. Without stopping his song, the lad halted in his march from time to time and played at knucklebones with some coins which he had in his hand, his whole fortune, probably. Among this money there was 1 40-sou piece. The child halted beside the bush, without perceiving Jean Valjean, and tossed up his handful of sous, which, up to that time, he had caught with a good deal of adroitness on the back of his hand. This time the 40-sou piece escaped him, and went rolling toward the brushwood until it reached Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean set his foot upon it. In the meantime, the child had looked after his coin and had caught sight of him. He showed no astonishment, but walked straight up to the man. The spot was absolutely solitary. As far as the eye could see, there was not a person on the plain or on the path. The only sound was the tiny, feeble cries of a flock of birds of passage, which was traversing the heavens at an immense height. The child was standing with his back to the sun, which cast threads of gold in his hair, and empurpled with its blood-red gleam the savage face of Jean Valjean. "Sir," said the little Savoyard, with that childish confidence which is composed of ignorance and innocence, "my money." "What is your name?" said Jean Valjean. "Little Gervais, sir." "Go away," said Jean Valjean. "Sir," resumed the child, "give me back my money." Jean Valjean dropped his head and made no reply. The child began again. "My money, sir." Jean Valjean's eyes remained fixed on the earth. "My piece of money!" cried the child. "My white piece! My silver!" It seemed as though Jean Valjean did not hear him. The child grasped him by the collar of his blouse and shook him. At the same time he made an effort to displace the big iron-shod shoe which rested on his treasure. "I want my piece of money! My piece of 40 sous!" The child wept. Jean Valjean raised his head. He still remained seated. His eyes were troubled. He gazed out at the child in a sort of amazement. Then he stretched out his hand towards his cudgel and cried in a terrible voice, "Who's there?" "I, sir," replied the child, "little Gervais.
"Aye, give me back my 40 sous, if you please. Take your foot away, sir, if you please." Then, irritated, though he was so small, and becoming almost menacing, "Come now, will you take your foot away? Take your foot away, or we'll see." "Ah, it's still you," said Jean Valjean, and rising abruptly to his feet, his foot still resting on the silver piece, he added, "Will you take yourself off?" The frightened child looked at him, then began to tremble from head to foot, and after a few moments of stupor, he set out, running at his top speed, without daring to turn his neck or to utter a cry. Nevertheless, lack of breath forced him to halt after a certain distance, and Jean Valjean heard him sobbing in the midst of his own reverie. At the end of a few moments, the child had disappeared. The sun had set. The shadows were descending around Jean Valjean. He had eaten nothing all day. It is probable that he was feverish. He had remained standing, and he had not changed his attitude after the child's flight. The breath heaved his chest at long and irregular intervals. His gaze, fixed 10 or 12 paces in front of him, seemed to be scrutinizing with profound attention the shape of an ancient fragment of blue earthenware which had fallen in the grass. All at once he shivered. He had just begun to feel the chill of evening. He settled his cap more firmly on his brow, sought mechanically to cross and button his blouse, advanced a step, and stopped to pick up his cudgel. At that moment he caught sight of the 40-sou piece, which his foot had half ground into the earth, and which was shining among the pebbles. It was as though he had received a galvanic shock. "What is this?" he muttered between his teeth. He recoiled 3 paces, then halted, without being able to detach his gaze from the spot which his foot had trodden but an instant before, as though the thing which lay glittering there in the gloom had been an open eye riveted upon him. At the expiration of a few moments, he darted convulsively toward the silver coin, seized it, and straightened himself up again, and began to gaze afar off over the plain, at the same time casting his eyes towards all points of the horizon, as he stood there erect and shivering, like a terrified wild animal which is seeking refuge. He saw nothing. Night was falling. The plain was cold and vague. Great banks of violet haze were rising in the gleam of the twilight. He said, "Ah!" and set out rapidly in the direction in which the child had disappeared. After about 30 paces he paused, looked about him, and saw nothing. Then he shouted with all his might, "Little Gervais! Little Gervais!" He paused and waited. There was no reply. The landscape was gloomy and deserted. He was encompassed by space. There was nothing around him but an obscurity in which his gaze was lost, and a silence which engulfed his voice. An icy north wind was blowing, and imparted to things around him a sort of lugubrious life. The bushes shook their thin little arms with incredible fury. One would have said that they were threatening and pursuing someone. He set out on his march again. Then he began to run, and from time to time he halted and shouted in that solitude, with a voice which was the most formidable and the most disconsolate that it was possible to hear. "Little Gervais! Little Gervais!" Assuredly, if the child had heard him, he would have been alarmed and would have taken good care not to show himself. But the child was no doubt already far away. He encountered a priest on horseback. He stepped up to him and said, "Monsieur le curé, have you seen a child pass?" "No," said the priest. "One named Little Gervais?" I have seen no one. He drew 2 5-franc pieces from his money-bag and handed them to the priest. Monsieur le Curé, this is for your poor people. Monsieur le Curé, he was a little lad, about 10 years old, with a marmot, I think, and a hurdy-gurdy. One of those Savoyards, you know. I have not seen him. Little Gervais, there are no villages here. Can you tell me? If he is like what you say, my friend, he is a little stranger. Such persons pass through these parts. We know nothing of them. Jean Valjean seized 2 more coins of 5 francs, each with violence, and gave them to the priest. For your poor, he said. Then he added wildly, Monsieur l'Abbé, have me arrested. I am a thief. The priest put spurs to his horse and fled in haste, much alarmed. Jean Valjean set out in a run, in the direction which he had first taken. In this way he traversed a tolerably long distance, gazing, calling, shouting, but he met no one. 2 or 3 times he ran across the plain, towards something which conveyed to him the effect of a human being reclining or crouching down. It turned out to be nothing but brushwood or rocks, nearly on a level with the earth. At length, at a spot where 3 paths intersected each other, he stopped. The moon had risen. He sent his gaze into the distance and shouted for the last time, Little Gervais! Little Gervais! Little Gervais! His shout died away in the midst, without even awaking an echo. He murmured yet once more, Little Gervais! But in a feeble and almost inarticulate voice. It was his last effort, but his legs gave way abruptly under him, as though an invisible power had suddenly overwhelmed him with the weight of his evil conscience. He fell, exhausted, on a large stone, his fists clenched in his hair, and his face on his knees, and he cried, I am a wretch! Then his heart burst, and he began to cry. It was the first time that he had wept in 19 years. When Jean Valjean left the bishop's house, he was, as we have seen, quite thrown out of everything that had been his thought hitherto. He could not yield to the evidence of what was going on within him. He hardened himself against the angelic action and the gentle words of the old man. You have promised me to become an honest man. I buy your soul. I take it away from the spirit of perversity. I give it to the good God. This recurred to his mind unceasingly. To this celestial kindness he opposed pride, which is the fortress of evil within us. He was indistinctly conscious that the pardon of this priest was the greatest assault and the most formidable attack which had moved him yet. That his obduracy was finally settled if he resisted this clemency. That if he yielded, he should be obliged to renounce that hatred with which the actions of other men had filled his soul through so many years, and which pleased him. That this time it was necessary to conquer or be conquered, and that a struggle, a colossal and final struggle, had been begun between his viciousness and the goodness of that man. In the presence of these lights, he proceeded like a man who is intoxicated. As he walked thus with haggard eyes, did he have a distinct perception of what might result to him from his adventure at D? Did he understand all those mysterious murmurs which warn or importune the spirit at certain moments of life? Did a voice whisper in his ear that he had just passed the solemn hour of his destiny, that there were no longer remaining a middle course for him, that if he were not henceforth the best of men, he would be the worst, that it behooved him now, so to speak, to mount higher than the bishop, or fall lower than the convict. That if he wished to become good, he must become an angel. That if he wished to remain evil, he must become a monster? Here again, some questions must be put, which we have already put to ourselves elsewhere. Did he catch some shadow of all this in his thought, in a confused way? Misfortune certainly, as we have said, does form the education of the intelligence. Nevertheless, it is doubtful whether Jean Valjean was in a condition to disentangle all that we have here indicated. If these ideas occurred to him, he but caught glimpses of, rather than saw them, and they only succeeded in throwing him into an unutterable and almost painful state of emotion. On emerging from that black and deformed thing which is called the galleys, the bishop had hurt his soul, as too vivid a light would have hurt his eyes on emerging from the dark. The future life, the possible life which offered itself to him henceforth, all pure and radiant, filled him with tremors and anxiety. He no longer knew where he really was, like an owl who should suddenly see the sunrise. The convict had been dazzled and blinded, as it were, by virtue. That which was certain, that which he did not doubt, was that he was no longer the same man, that everything about him was changed, that it was no longer in his power to make it as though the bishop had not spoken to him and had not touched him. In this state of mind he had encountered little Gervais, and had robbed him of his 40 sous. Why? He certainly could not have explained it. Was this the last effect and the supreme effort, as it were, of the evil thoughts which he had brought away from the galleys, a remnant of impulse, a result of what is called in statics acquired force? It was that, and it was also, perhaps, even less than that. Let us say it simply. It was not he who stole, it was not the man, it was the beast, who, by habit and instinct, had simply placed his foot upon that money, while the intelligence was struggling amid so many novel and hitherto unheard-of thoughts besetting it. When intelligence reawakened and beheld that action of the brute, Jean Valjean recoiled with anguish and uttered a cry of terror. It was because, strange phenomenon, and one which was possible only in the situation in which he found himself, in stealing that money from that child, he had done a thing of which he was no longer capable. However that may be, this last evil action had a decisive effect on him. It abruptly traversed that chaos which he bore in his mind, and dispersed it, placed on one side the thick obscurity, and on the other the light, and acted on his soul, in the state in which it then was, as certain chemical reagents act upon a troubled mixture by precipitating one element and clarifying the other. First of all, even before examining himself and reflecting, all bewildered, like one who seeks to save himself, he tried to find the child in order to return his money to him. Then, when he recognized the fact that this was impossible, he halted in despair. At that moment when he exclaimed, "I am a wretch!" he had just perceived what he was, and he was already separated from himself to such a degree that he seemed to himself to be no longer anything more than a phantom, as if he had, therefore before him, in flesh and blood, the hideous galley convict, Jean Valjean, cudgel in hand, his blouse on his hips, his knapsack filled with stolen objects on his back, with his resolute and gloomy visage, with his thoughts filled with abominable projects. Excess of unhappiness had, as we have remarked, made him in some sort of a visionary. This, then, was in the nature of a vision. He actually saw that Jean Valjean, that sinister face, before him. He had almost reached the point of asking himself who that man was, and he was horrified by him. His brain was going through one of those violent and yet perfectly calm moments in which reverie is so profound that it absorbs reality. one no longer beholds the object which one has before one, and one sees, as though apart from oneself, the figures which one has in one's own mind. Thus he contemplated himself, so to speak, face to face, and at the same time, athwart this hallucination, he perceived in a mysterious depth a sort of light which he at first took for a torch. On scrutinizing this light, which appeared to his conscience with more attention, he recognized the fact that it possessed a human form, and that this torch was the bishop. His conscience weighed in turn these two men thus placed before it, the bishop and Jean Valjean. Nothing less than the first was required to soften the second. By one of those singular effects which are peculiar to this sort of ecstasies, in proportion as his reverie continued, as the bishop grew great and resplendent in his eyes, so did Jean Valjean grow less and vanish. After a certain time, he was no longer anything more than a shade. All at once he disappeared. The bishop alone remained. He filled the whole soul of this wretched man with a magnificent radiance. Jean Valjean wept for a long time. He wept burning tears. He sobbed with more weakness than a woman, with more fright than a child. As he wept, daylight penetrated more and more clearly into his soul. An extraordinary light, a light at once ravishing and terrible. His past life, his first fault, his long expiation, his external brutishness, his internal hardness, his dismissal to liberty, rejoicing in manifold plans of vengeance. What had happened to him at the bishop's? The last thing that he had done, that theft of 40 sous from a child, a crime all the more cowardly and all the more monstrous since it had come after the bishop's pardon. All this recurred to his mind and appeared clearly to him, but with a clearness which he had never hitherto witnessed. He examined his life, and it seemed horrible to him, his soul, and it seemed frightful to him. In the meantime, a gentle light rested over this life and this soul. It seemed to him that he had beheld Satan by the light of paradise. How many hours did he weep thus? What did he do after he wept? Whither did he go? No one ever knew. The only thing which seems to be authenticated is that that same night the carrier who served Grenoble at that epoch, who arrived at D about 3 o'clock in the morning, saw, as he traversed the street in which the bishop's residence was situated, a man in the attitude of prayer, kneeling on that pavement in the shadow, in front of the door of Monseigneur Welcome. End of Book 2, Chapter 13.
For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty Grebe in Wapella, Illinois. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3, Chapter 1. The year 1817. 1817 is the year which Louis XVIII, with a certain royal assurance which was not wanting in pride, entitled the 22nd of his reign. It is the year in which M. Bruguiere de Sorsum was celebrated. All the hairdressers' shops, hoping for powder and the return of the royal bird, were besmeared with azure and decked with fleurs-de-lis. It was the candid time at which Count Lynch sat every Sunday as churchwarden in the churchwarden's pew of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, in his costume of a peer of France, with his red ribbon and his long nose, and the majesty of profile peculiar to a man who has performed a brilliant action. The brilliant action performed by M. Lynch was this. Being mayor of Bordeaux on the 12th of March, 1814, he had surrendered the city a little too promptly to M. the Duc d'Angoulême, hence his peerage. In 1817, fashion swallowed up little boys of from 4 to 6 years of age in vast caps of morocco leather, with ear-tabs resembling esquimaumitres. The French army was dressed in white, after the mode of the Austrian. The regiments were called legions. Instead of numbers, they bore the names of departments. Napoleon was at St. Helena, and since England refused him green cloth, he was having his old coats turned. In 1817, Pellegrini sang, Mademoiselle Bigottini danced, Potier reigned, Audrey did not yet exist. Madame Saqui had succeeded to Furioso. There were still Prussians in France. M. Delalot was a personage. Legitimacy had just asserted itself by cutting off the hand, then the head, of Plenier, of Carbonneau, and of Talleyrand. The Prince de Talleyrand, Grand Chamberlain, and the Abbé Louis, appointed Minister of Finance, laughed as they looked at each other, with the laugh of the two augurs, both whom had celebrated on the 14th of July, 1790, the Mass of Federation in the Champ de Mars. Talleyrand said it as bishop. Louis had served it in the capacity of deacon. In 1817, in the side alleys of this same Champ de Mars, 2 great cylinders of wood might have been seen lying in the rain, rotting amid the grass, painted blue, with traces of eagles and bees, from which the gilding was falling. These were the columns which 2 years before had upheld the Emperor's platform in the Champ de Mai. They were blackened here and there with the scorches of the bivouac of Austrians encamped near Gros Caillou. 2 or 3 of these columns had disappeared in these bivouac fires, and had warmed the large hands of the imperial troops. The Field of May had this remarkable point, that it had been held in the month of June, and in the Field of March, Mars. In this year, 1817, 2 things were popular, the Voltaire Toquet and the snuff-box à la Charter. The most recent Parisian sensation was the crime of Dautun, who had thrown his brother's head into the fountain of the flower market. They had begun to feel anxious at the Naval Department, on account of the lack of news from that fatal frigate, the Medusa, which was destined to cover Champmeray with infamy and Géricault with glory. Colonel Selves was going to Egypt to become Solomon Pasha. The palace of Thermes, in the Rue de la Harpe, served as a shop for a cooper. On the platform of the octagonal tower of the Hôtel de Cluny, the little shed of boards which had served as an observatory to Messier, the naval astronomer under Louis XIV, was still to be seen. The Duchess de Duras read to 3 or 4 friends her unpublished Ourika, in her boudoir furnished by 10 in sky-blue satin. The ends were scratched off the Louvre. The bridge of Austerlitz had abdicated, and was entitled the Bridge of the King's Garden, du Jardin du Roi, a double enigma, which disguised the bridge of Austerlitz and the Jardin des Plantes at one stroke. Louis XVIII, much preoccupied while annotating Horace with the corner of his fingernail, heroes who have become emperors, and makers of wooden shoes who have become dauphins, had 2 anxieties. Napoleon, and Mathurin Brunel. The French Academy had given for its prize subject the happiness procured through study. M. Bellart was officially eloquent. In his shadow could be seen germinating that future Advocate General of Bras, dedicated to the sarcasms of Paul Louis Courier. There was a false Chateaubriand named Marchangy in the interim until there should be a false Marchangy named d'Alincourt. Claire d'Albe and Malik Adel were masterpieces. Madame Cottin was proclaimed the chief writer of the epoch. The Institute had the academician, Napoleon Bonaparte, stricken from its list of members. A royal ordinance erected Angoulême into a naval school. For the Duc d'Angoulême being Lord High Admiral, it was evident that the city of Angoulême had all the qualities of a seaport. Otherwise the monarchical principle would have received a wound. In the Council of Ministers the question was agitated whether vignettes representing slack-rope performances which adorned Franconi's advertising posters and which attracted throngs of street urchins should be tolerated. M. Père, the author of Agnès, a good sort of fellow, with a square face and a wart on his cheek, directed the little private concerts of the Marquis de Sassenay in the Rue Ville l'Evêque. All the young girls were singing the Hermit of Saint-Aville, with words by Edmond Giraud. The Yellow Dwarf was transferred into Murat. The Café Lemblin stood up for the Emperor against the Café Valois, which upheld the Bourbons. The Duc de Berry, already surveyed from the shadow by Louvel, had just been married to a princess of Sicily. Madame de Staël had died a year previously. The bodyguard hissed Mademoiselle Mars. The grand newspapers were all very small. Their form was restricted, but their liberty was great. The Constitutionnel was constitutional. La Minerve called Chateaubriand, Chateaubriand. That made the good middle-class people laugh heartily at the expense of the great writer. In journals which sold themselves, prostituted journalists insulted the exiles of 1815. David had no longer any talent. Arnault had no longer any wit. Carnot was no longer honest. Soult had won no battles. It is true that Napoleon had no longer any genius. No one is ignorant of the fact that letters sent to an exile by post very rarely reached him, as the police made it their religious duty to intercept them. This is no new fact. Descartes complained of it in his exile. Now David, having, in a Belgian publication, shown some displeasure at not receiving letters which had been written to him, it struck the royalist journals as amusing, and they derided the proscribed man well on this occasion. What separated two men more than a bis was to say the regicides, or to say the voters, to say the enemies, or to say the allies, to say Napoleon, or to say Bonaparte. All sensible people were agreed that the era of revolution had been closed forever by King Louis XVIII, surnamed the immortal Arthur of the Château. On the platform of the Pont Neuf, the word Redivivus was carved on the pedestal that awaited the statue of Henry IV. M. Paillet, in the Rue de Teresa, No. 4, was making the rough draft of his Privy Assembly to consolidate the monarchy. The leaders of the right said at grave conjunctures, "We must write to Bacot." M. Canuel, O'Mahony, and de Chapadelaine were preparing the sketch, to some extent with Monsieur's approval, of what was to become later on the conspiracy of the Bordeleux of the waterside. L'Épingle Noire was already plotting in his own quarter. De la Verderie was conferring with Trogoff. M. Decazes, who was liberal to a degree, reigned. Chateaubriand stood every morning at his window at number 27 Rue Saint-Dominique, clad in footed trousers and slippers, with a Madras kerchief knotted over his grey hair, with his eyes fixed on a mirror, a complete set of dentist instruments spread out before him, cleaning his teeth, which were charming, while he dictated the Monarchy according to the Charter to M. Pilorge, his secretary. Criticism, assuming an authoritative tone, preferred La Fawn to Talma. M. de Féletez signed himself A. M. Hoffman signed himself Z. Charles Nodier wrote Thérèse Albert. Divorce was abolished. Lyceums called themselves colleges. The collegians, decorated on the collar with a golden fleur-de-lis, fought each other apropos of the King of Rome. The counter-police of the château had denounced to Her Royal Highness Madame the portrait, everywhere exhibited, of M. the Duc d'Orléans, who made a better appearance in his uniform of a colonel-general of hussars than M. the Duc de Berry in his uniform of colonel-general of dragoons, a serious inconvenience. The city of Paris was having the dome of the Invalides regilded at its own expense. Serious men asked themselves what M. de Trinquelague would do on such an occasion. M. Clausel de Montauz differed on divers points from M. Clausel de Coussergues. M. de Salaberry was not satisfied. The comedian Picard, who belonged to the Academy, which the comedian Molière had not been able to do, had the two Philiberts played at the Odeon, upon whose pediment the removal of the letter still allowed Theatre of the Empress to be plainly read. People took part for or against Cugnet de Montelot. Fabvier was factious, Bavot was revolutionary. The liberal Pélissier published an edition of Voltaire with following title: Works of Voltaire, the French Academy. That will attract purchasers, said the ingenious editor. The general opinion was that M. Charles Loyson would be the genius of the century. Envy was beginning to gnaw at him, a sign of glory, and this verse was composed on him. Even when Loyson steals, one feels that he has paws. As Cardinal Fesch refused to resign, M. de Pins, Archbishop of Amasie, administered the diocese of Lyons. The quarrel over the valley of Dappe was begun between Switzerland and France by a memoir from Captain, afterwards General Dufour. Saint-Simon, ignored, was erecting his sublime dream. There was a celebrated Fourier at the Academy of Science, whom posterity has forgotten, and in some garret an obscure Fourier, whom the future will recall. Lord Byron was beginning to make his mark. A note to a poem by Millevoye introduced him to France in these terms: a certain Lord Baron. David d'Angers was trying to work in marble. The Abbé Caron was speaking, in terms of praise, to a private gathering of seminarists in the blind alley of Feuillantines, of an unknown priest, named Félicité Robert, who at a later date became Lemony. A thing which smoked and clattered on the Seine with the noise of a swimming dog went and came beneath the windows of the Tuileries, from the Pont Royal to the Pont Louis XV. It was a piece of mechanism which was not good for much, a sort of plaything, the idle dream of a dream-ridden inventor, an utopia, a steamboat. The Parisians stared indifferently at this useless thing. M. de Vaublanc, the reformer of the Institute by a coup d'etat, The distinguished author of numerous academicians, ordinances, and batches of members, after having created them, could not succeed in becoming one himself. The Faubourg Saint-Germain and the Pavillon de Marsan wished to have M. Delaveau for prefect of police on account of his piety. Dupuytren and Recamier entered into a quarrel in the amphitheatre of the School of Medicine, and threatened each other with their fists on the subject of the divinity of Jesus Christ. Cuvier, with one eye on Genesis and the other on nature, tried to please bigoted reaction by reconciling fossils with texts and by making mastodons flatter Moses. M. François de Neufchâteau, the praiseworthy cultivator of the memory of Parmentier, made 1,000 efforts to have the pomme de terre, potato, pronounced Parmentier, and succeeded therein not at all. The Abbé Grégoire, ex-bishop, ex-conventionary, ex-senator, had passed, in the royal polemics, to the state of infamous Grégoire, the locution of which we have made use, passed to the state of, has been condemned as a neologism by M. Royer-Collard. Under the third arch of the Pont du Jena, the new stone with which, the 2 years previously, the mining aperture made by Blücher to blow up the bridge had been stopped up, was still recognizable on account of its whiteness. Justice summoned to its bar a man who, on seeing the Comte d'Artois enter Notre Dame, had said aloud, "Sapristi! I regret the time when I saw Bonaparte and Talma enter the Belle Sauvage, arm in arm." A seditious utterance. 6 months in prison. Traitors showed themselves unbuttoned. Men who had gone over to the enemy on the eve of battle made no secret of their recompense, and strutted immodestly in the light of day, in the cynicism of riches and dignities. Deserters from Ligny and Quatre Bras, in their brazenness of their well-paid turpitude, exhibited their devotion to the monarchy in most barefaced manner. This is what floats up confusedly, pell-mell for the year 1817, and is now forgotten. History neglects nearly all these particulars, and cannot do otherwise. The infinity would overwhelm it. Nevertheless, these details, which are wrongly called trivial, there are no trivial facts in humanity, nor little leaves in vegetation, are useful. It is of the signomy of the years that the signomy of the centuries is composed. In this year of 1817, 4 young Parisians arranged a fine farce. End of Book 3, Chapter 1 of Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Recording by Betty Grebe in Wapella, Illinois.
Here, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lisa Cho. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3 in the year 1817. Chapter 2. A Double Quartet. These Parisians came, one from Toulouse, another from Limoges, the third from Cahors, and the fourth from Montauban. But they were students, and when one says student, one says Parisian. To study in Paris is to be born in Paris. These young men were insignificant. Every one has seen such faces, 4 specimens of humanity taken at random, neither good nor bad, neither wise nor ignorant, neither geniuses nor fools, handsome, with that charming April which is called 20 years. They were 4 Oscars, for at that epoch Arthurs did not yet exist. "Burn for him the perfumes of Araby," exclaimed Romance. Oscar advances. "Oscar, I shall behold him." People had just emerged from Ossian. Elegance was Scandinavian and Caledonian. The pure English style was only to prevail later, and the first of the Arthurs, Wellington, had but just won the Battle of Waterloo. These Oscars bore the names, one of Félix Tholomyès of Toulouse, the second Listolier of Cahors, the next Fameuil of Limoges, the last Blachevelle of Montauban. Naturally, each of them had his mistress. Blachevelle loved Favourite, so named because she had been in England. Listolier adored Dahlia, who had taken for her nickname the name of a flower. Fameuil idolized Zéphine, an abridgment of Josephine. Tholomyès had Fantine, called the Blonde, because of her beautiful sunny hair. Favourite, Dahlia, Zéphine, and Fantine were 4 ravishing young women, perfumed and radiant, still a little like working women, and not yet entirely divorced from their needles. Somewhat disturbed by intrigues, but still retaining on their faces something of the serenity of toil, and in their souls that flower of honesty which survives the first fall in woman. One of the 4 was called the Young, because she was the youngest of them, and one was called the Old. The old one was 23. Not to conceal anything, the 3 first were more experienced, more heedless, and more emancipated into the tumult of life than Fantine the Blonde, who was still in her first illusions. Dahlia, Zéphine, and especially Favourite could not have said as much. There had already been more than one episode in their romance, though hardly begun, and the lover who had borne the name of Adolphe in the first chapter had turned out to be Alphonse in the second, and Gustave in the third. Poverty and coquetry are 2 fatal counselors. One scolds and the other flatters, and the beautiful daughters of the people have both of them whispering in their ear, each on its own side. These badly guarded souls listen. Hence the falls which they accomplish, and the stones which are thrown at them. They are overwhelmed with splendor of all that is immaculate and inaccessible. Alas! What if the Jungfrau were hungry? Favourite, having been in England, was admired by Dahlia and Zéphine. She had had an establishment of her own very early in life. Her father was an old unmarried professor of mathematics, a brutal man and a braggart, who went out to give lessons in spite of his age. This professor, when he was a young man, had one day seen a chambermaid's gown catch on a fender. He had fallen in love in consequence of this accident. The result had been Favourite. She met her father from time to time, and he bowed to her. One morning an old woman with the air of a devotee had entered her apartments and had said to her, "You do not know me, mademoiselle." "No." "I am your mother." Then the old woman opened the sideboard and ate and drank, had a mattress which she owned brought in, and installed herself. This cross and pious old mother never spoke to Favourite, remained hours without uttering a word, breakfasted, dined, and supped for 4, and went down to the porter's quarters for company, where she spoke ill of her daughter. It was having rosy nails that were too pretty which had drawn Dahlia to Listolier, to others, perhaps, to idleness. How could she make such nails work? She who wishes to remain virtuous must not have pity on her hands. As for Zéphine, she had conquered Fameuil by her roguish and caressing little way of saying, "Yes, sir." The young men were comrades, the young girls were friends. Such loves are always accompanied by such friendships. Goodness and philosophy are 2 distinct things. The proof of this is that, after making all due allowances for these little irregular households, Favourite, Zéphine, and Dahlia were philosophical young women, while Fantine was a good girl. Good, someone will exclaim. And Tholomyès? Solomon would reply that love forms a part of wisdom. We will confine ourselves to saying that the love of Fantine was a first love, a soul love, a faithful love. She alone, of all the 4, was not called thou by a single one of them. Fantine was one of those beings who blossom, so to speak, from the dregs of the people. Though she had emerged from the most unfathomable depths of social shadow, she bore on her brow the sign of the anonymous and the unknown. She was born at Montreuil-sur-Mer, of what parents? Who can say? She had never known father or mother. She was called Fantine. Why Fantine? She had never borne any other name. At the epoch of her birth the Directory still existed. She had no family name. She had no family, no baptismal name. The Church no longer existed. She bore the name which pleased the first random passer-by who had encountered her when a very small child running bare-legged in the street. She received the name as she received the water from the clouds upon her brow when it rained. She was called Little Fantine. No one knew more than that. This human creature had entered life in just this way. At the age of 10, Fantine quitted the town and went to service with some farmers in the neighborhood. At 15 she came to Paris to seek her fortune. Fantine was beautiful, and remained pure as long as she could. She was a lovely blonde with fine teeth. She had gold and pearls for her dowry, but her gold was on her head, and her pearls were in her mouth. She worked for her living, then still for the sake of her living. For the heart also has its hunger. She loved. She loved Tholomyès. An amour for him, passion for her. The streets of the Latin Quarter, filled with throngs of students and grisettes, saw the beginning of their dream. Fantine had long evaded Tholomyès in the mazes of the hill of the Pantheon, where so many adventurers twine and untwine, but in such a way as constantly to encounter him again. There is a way of avoiding which resembles seeking. In short, the eclogue took place. Blachevelle, Listolier, and Fameuil formed a sort of group of which Tholomyès was the head. It was he who possessed the wit. Tholomyès was the antique old student. He was rich, he had an income of 4,000 francs. 4,000 francs! A splendid scandal on Mount Sainte Geneviève. Tholomyès was a fast man of 30, and badly preserved. He was wrinkled and toothless, and he had the beginning of a bald spot, of which he himself said with sadness, the skull at 30, the knee at 40. His digestion was mediocre, and he had been attacked by a watering in one eye. But in proportion as his youth disappeared, gaiety was kindled. He replaced his teeth with buffooneries, his hair with mirth, his health with irony, his weeping eye laughed incessantly. He was dilapidated, but still in flower. His youth, which was packing up for departure long before its time, beat a retreat in good order, bursting with laughter, and no one saw anything but fire. He had had a piece rejected at the vaudeville. He made a few verses now and then. In addition to this, he doubted everything to the last degree, which is a vast force in the eyes of the weak. Being thus ironical and bald, he was the leader. Iron is an English word. Is it possible that irony is derived from it? One day Tholomyès took the three others aside, with the gesture of an oracle, and said to them, Fantine, Dahlia, Zéphine, and Favourite have been teasing us for nearly a year to give them a surprise. We have promised them solemnly that we would. They are forever talking about it to us, to me in particular, just as the old women in Naples cry to Saint Januarius, Faccia gialluta, fa o miracolo. Yellow face, perform thy miracle. So our beauties say to me incessantly, Tholomyès, when will you bring forth your surprise? At the same time, our parents keep writing to us, pressure on both sides. The moment has arrived, it seems to me. Let us discuss the question. Thereupon Tholomyès lowered his voice and articulated something so mirthful that a vast and enthusiastic grin broke out upon the four mouths simultaneously, and Blachevelle exclaimed, That is an idea. A smoky tap-room presented itself. They entered, and the remainder of their confidential colloquy was lost in shadow. The result of these shades was a dazzling pleasure party which took place on the following Sunday, the four young men inviting the four young girls. End of Book 3, Chapter 2.
LibriVox.org. Read by Sean O'Hara. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3, in the year 1817, Chapter 3, 4 and 4. It is hard nowadays to picture to oneself what a pleasure trip of students and grisettes to the country was like 45 years ago. The suburbs of Paris are no longer the same. The physiognomy of what may be called circum-Parisian life has changed completely in the last half-century. Where there was the cuckoo, there is the railway car. Where there was a tender boat, there is now the steamboat. People speak of Fécamp nowadays as they spoke of St. Cloud in those days. The Paris of 1862 is a city which has France for its outskirts. The four couples conscientiously went through with all the country follies possible at that time. The vacation was beginning, and it was a warm, bright summer day. On the preceding day, Favourite, the only one who knew how to write, had written the following to Tholomyès in the name of the four. It is a good hour to emerge from happiness. That is why they arose at 5 o'clock in the morning. They went to St. Cloud by the coach, looked at the dry cascade, and exclaimed, "This must be very beautiful when there is water." They breakfasted at Tête Noire, where Carstaing had not yet been. They treated themselves to a game of ring-throwing under the quincunx of trees of the Grand Fountain. They ascended Diogenes' lantern. They gambled for macaroons at the roulette establishment at Pont de Sèvres, picked up bouquets at Pétot, brought reed pipes at Neuilly, ate apple tarts everywhere, and were perfectly happy. Young girls rustled and chatted like warblers escaped from their cage. It was a perfect delirium. From time to time they bestowed little taps on the young men. Matutinal intoxication of life. Adorable years, the wings of the dragonfly quiver. Oh, whoever you may be, do you not remember? Have you rambled through the brushwood, holding aside the branches on account of the charming head which is coming on behind you? Have you slid laughing down a slope all wet with rain, with the beloved woman holding your hand and crying, "Ah, my new boots! What a state they are in!" Let us say at once that that merry obstacle, a shower, was lacking in the case of this good-humored party, although Favourite had said, as they set out, with magisterial and maternal tone, "The slugs are crawling in the paths. A sign of rain, children." All four were madly pretty. A good old classic poet, then famous, a good fellow who had an Eleanor, Monsieur le Chevalier de la Brise, as he strolled that day beneath the chestnut trees of St. Cloud, saw them pass about 10 o'clock in the morning and exclaimed, "There's one too many of them," as he thought of the Graces. Favourite, Blanchevelle's friend, one aged 23, the old one, ran on in front under the great green boughs, jumped the ditches, stalked distractedly over bushes, and presided over this merrymaking with the spirit of a young female faun. Zéphine and Dahlia, whom chance had made beautiful in such a way that they set each other off when they were together, and completed each other, never left each other, more from an instinct of coquetry than from friendship, and clinging to each other, they assumed English poses. The first keepsakes had just made their appearance. Melancholy was dawning for women, as later on, Byronism dawned for men, and the hair of the tender sex began to droop dolefully. Zéphine and Dahlia had their hair dressed in rolls. Listolier and Fameuil, who were engaged in discussing their professors, explained to Fantine the difference that existed between Monsieur Delvincourt and Monsieur Blondeau. Blachevelle seemed to have been created expressly to carry Favourite's single-bordered imitation India shawl of Ternaux manufacture on his arms on Sunday. Tholomyès followed, dominating the group. He was very gay, but one felt the force of government in him. There was dictation in his joviality. His principal ornament was a pair of trousers of elephant leg pattern of nankeen, with straps of braided copper wire. He carried a stout rattan worth 200 francs in his hand, and he treated himself to everything, a strange thing called a cigar, in his mouth. Nothing was sacred to him. He smoked. "That Tholomyès is astounding," said the others with veneration. "What trousers! What energy!" As for Fantine, she was a joy to behold. Her splendid teeth had evidently received an office from God, laughter. She preferred to carry her little hat of sewed straw, with its long white strings, in her hand rather than on her head. Her thick blonde hair, which was inclined to wave, and which easily uncoiled, and which it was necessary to fasten up incessantly, seemed made for the flight of the Galatea under the willows. Her rosy lips babbled enchantingly. The corners of her mouth, voluptuously turned up, as in the antique masks of Erigone, had an air of encouraging the audacious. But her long, shadowy lashes drooped discreetly over the jollity of the lower part of her face, as though to call a halt. There was something indescribably harmonious and striking about her entire dress. She wore a gown of mauve barège, little reddish-brown buskins, whose ribbons traced the necks on her fine, white, open-worked stockings, and that sort of muslin spencer, a Marseille invention, whose name, Quenouzeau, a corruption of the words quinze août, pronounced after the fashion of Canbière, signifies fine weather, heat, and midday. The three others, less timid as we have already said, wore low-necked dresses without disguise, which in summer, beneath flower-adorned hats, are very graceful and enticing. But by the side of these audacious outfits, blonde Fantine's canazo, with its transparencies, its indiscretions, its reticence, concealing and displaying at one and the same time, seemed an alluring godsend of decency, and the famous court of love, presided by the Vicomtesse de Cosette, with the sea-green eyes, would, perhaps, have awarded the prize for coquetry to this canazo, in the contest for the prize of modesty. The most ingenious is, at times, the wisest. This does happen. Brilliant of face, delicate of profile, with eyes of a deep blue, heavy lids, feet arched and small, wrists and ankles admirably formed, a white skin, which here and there allowed the azure branching of the veins to be seen, joy, a cheek that was young and fresh, the robust throat of the Juno Vagina, a strong and supple nape of the neck, shoulders modeled as though by Cousteau, with a voluptuous dimple in the middle, visible through the muslin, a gaiety cooled by dreaminess. Sculptural and exquisite, such was Fantine. And beneath these feminine adornments and these ribbons one could divine a statue, and in that statue a soul. Fantine was beautiful without being conscious of it. Those rare dreamers, mysterious priests of the beautiful who silently confront everything with perfection, would have caught a glimpse in this little working woman, through the transparency of her Parisian grace, of the ancient sacred euphony. This daughter of the shadows was thoroughbred. She was beautiful in the two ways, style and rhythm. Style is the form of the ideal. Rhythm is its movement. We have said that Fantine was joy. She was also modesty. To an observer who studied her attentively, that which breathed from her athwart all the intoxication of her age, the season, and her love affair, was an invincible expression of reserve and modesty. She remained a little astonished. This chaste astonishment is the shade of difference that separates Psyche from Venus. Fantine had the long, white fingers of the Vestal Virgin who stirs the ashes of the sacred fire with a golden pin. Although she would have refused nothing to Tholomyès, as we shall have more than ample opportunity to see, her face in repose was supremely virginal. A sort of serious and almost austere dignity suddenly overwhelmed her at certain times, and there is nothing more singular and disturbing than to see gaiety become so suddenly extinct there, and meditation succeed to cheerfulness without any transition state. This sudden and sometimes severely accentuated gravity resembled the disdain of a goddess. Her brow, her nose, her chin, presented that equilibrium of outline which is quite distinct from equilibrium of proportion, and from which harmony of countenance results. In the very characteristic interval which separates the base of the nose from the upper lip, she had that imperceptible and charming fold, a mysterious sign of chastity, which makes Barbarossa fall in love with the Diana found in the treasures of Iconia. Love is a fault, so be it. Fantine was innocence floating high over fault. End of Book 3, Chapter 3.
LibriVox.org. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3. In the year 1817. Chapter 4. Tholomyès is so merry that he sings a Spanish ditty. That day was composed of dawn from one end to the other. All nature seemed to be having a holiday and to be laughing. The flower beds of St. Cloud perfumed the air, the breath of the Seine rustled the leaves vaguely, the branches gesticulated in the wind, bees pillaged the jasmines, a whole bohemia of butterflies swooped down upon the yarrow, the clover, and the sterile oats. A whole bohemia of butterflies swooped down upon the yarrow, the clover, and the sterile oats. In the august park of the King of France there was a pack of vagabonds, the birds. The four merry couples, mingled with the sun, the fields, the flowers, the trees, were resplendent. And in this community of paradise, talking, singing, running, dancing, chasing butterflies, plucking convolvulus, wetting their pink, open-work stockings in the tall grass, fresh, wild, without malice, all received to some extent the kisses of all, with the exception of Fantine, who was hedged about with that vague resistance of hers, composed of dreaminess and wildness, and who was in love. "You always have a queer look about you," said Favourite to her. "Such things are joys. These passages of happy couples are a profound appeal to life and nature, and make a caress and light spring forth from everything. There was once a fairy who created the fields and forests expressly for those in love, in that eternal hedge school of lovers, which is forever beginning anew, and which will last as long as there are hedges and scholars. Hence the popularity of spring among thinkers. The patrician and the knife grinder, the duke and the peer, the limb of the law, the courtiers and townspeople, as they used to say in olden times, are all subjects of this fairy. They laugh and hunt, and there is in the air the brilliance of an apotheosis. What a transfiguration effected by love! Notaries' clerks are gods. And the little cries, the pursuits through the grass, the waist's embrace on the fly, those jargons which are melodies, those adorations which burst forth in the manner of pronouncing a syllable, those cherries torn from one mouth by another, all this blazes forth and takes its place among the celestial glories. Beautiful women waste themselves sweetly. They think that this will never come to an end. Philosophers, poets, painters, observe these ecstasies and know not what to make of it, so greatly are they dazzled by it. "The departure for Cythera!" exclaims Watteau. Lancret, the painter of plebeians, contemplates his bourgeois who have flitted away into the azure sky. Diderot stretches out his arms to all those love idyls, and D'Urfé mingles druids with them. After breakfast the four couples went to what was then called the King's Square to see a newly arrived plant from India, whose name escapes our memory at this moment, and which at that epoch was attracting all Paris to St. Cloud. It was an odd and charming shrub with a long stem, whose numerous branches, bristling and leafless and as fine as threads, were covered with a million tiny white rosettes. This gave the shrub the air of a head of hair studded with flowers. There was always an admiring crowd about it. After viewing the thub, Tholomyès exclaimed, "I offer you asses!" and having agreed upon a price with the owner of the asses, they returned by way of Vanvres and Issy. At Issy an incident occurred. The truly national park, at that time owned by Burgon the contractor, happened to be wide open. They passed the gates, visited the mannequin anchorite in his grotto, tried the mysterious little effects of the famous cabinet of mirrors, the wanton trap worthy of a satyr become a millionaire or of Tuscarora metamorphosed into a Priapus. They had stoutly shaken the swing attached to the two chestnut trees celebrated by the Abbé de Bernis. As he swung these beauties, one after the other, produced folds in the fluttering skirts, which Greuze would have found to his taste, amid peals of laughter, the Toulousan Tholomyès, who was somewhat of a Spaniard, Toulouse being the cousin of Tolosa, sprang to a melancholy chant the old ballad Gallega, probably inspired by some lovely maid dashing in full flight upon a rope between two trees. Soy de Badios, amor mi llama, toda mi alma es en mi ojos, porque enseñas a tuas piernas. Badajoz is my home, and love is my name. To all my eyes in flame, all my soul doth come. For instruction meet, I receive at thy feet. Fantine alone refused to swing. "I don't like to have people put on airs like that," muttered Favourite, with a good deal of acrimony. After leaving the asses there was a fresh delight. They crossed the Seine in a boat, and proceeding from Passy on foot they reached the barrier of L'Étoile. They had been up since 5 o'clock that morning, as the reader will remember, but bah! There is no such thing as fatigue on Sunday, said Favourite. On Sunday fatigue does not work. About 3 o'clock the four couples, frightened at their happiness, were sliding down the Russian mountains, a singular edifice which then occupied the heights of Beaujon, and whose undulating line was visible above the trees of the Champs Elysees. From time to time Favourite exclaimed, "And the surprise? I claim the surprise." "Patience," replied Tholomyès. End of Book 3, Chapter 4.
Or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sarah Williams. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3, in the year 1817, Chapter 5, at Bombardas. The Russian mountains having been exhausted, they began to think about dinner, and the radiant party of 8, somewhat weary at last, became stranded in Bombarda's public-house, a branch establishment which had been set up in the Champs-Élysées by that famous restaurant-keeper, Bombarda, whose sign could then be seen in the Rue de Rivoli, near Delorme Alley. A large but ugly room, with an alcove and a bed at the end, they had been obliged to put up with this accommodation in view of the Sunday crowd. 2 windows whence they could survey beyond the elms, the quay, and the river, a magnificent August sunlight lightly touching the panes, 2 tables, upon one of them a triumphant mountain of bouquets, mingled with the hats of men and women, at the other end 4 couples seated round a merry confusion of platters, dishes, glasses, and bottles. Jugs of beer mingled with flasks of wine, very little order on the table, some disorder beneath it. They made beneath the table a noise, a clatter of the feet that was abominable, says Molière. This was the state which the shepherd idyll, begun at 5 o'clock in the morning, had reached at 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was setting, their appetites were satisfied. The Champs-Élysées, filled with sunshine and with people, were nothing but light and dust, the 2 things of which glory is composed. The horses of Marly, those neighing marbles, were prancing in a cloud of gold. Carriages were going and coming. A squadron of magnificent bodyguards, with their clarions at their head, were descending the Avenue de Neuilly. The white flag, showing faintly rosy in the setting sun, floated over the dome of the Tuileries. The Place de la Concorde, which had become the Place Louis XV once more, was choked with happy promenaders. Many wore the silver fleur-de-lis suspended from the white-watered ribbon, which had not yet wholly disappeared from the buttonholes in the year 1817. Here and there choruses of little girls threw to the winds, amid the passers-by, who formed into circles and applauded, the then celebrated Bourbon air, which was destined to strike the 100 days with lightning, and which had for its refrain, "Rendez-nous notre père de Gand, rendez-nous notre père. Give us back our father from Ghent, give us back our father." Groups of dwellers in the suburbs, in Sunday array, sometimes even decorated with the fleur-de-lis, like the bourgeois, scattered over the large square and the Marigny square, were playing at rings and revolving on the wooden horses. Others were engaged in drinking. Some journeyman printers had on paper cups. Their laughter was audible. Everything was radiant. It was a time of undisputed peace and profound royalist security. It was the epoch when a special and private report of Chief of Police Angelet to the King on the subject of the suburbs of Paris terminated with these lines: "Taking all things into consideration, sire, there is nothing to be feared from these people. They are as heedless and as indolent as cats. The population is restless in the provinces. It is not in Paris. These are very pretty men, sire. It would take all of 2 of them to make one of your grenadiers. There is nothing to be feared on the part of the populace of Paris the capital. It is remarkable that the stature of this population should have diminished in the last 50 years, and the populace of the suburbs is still more puny than at the time of the Revolution. It is not dangerous. In short, it is an amiable rabble." Prefects of the police do not deem it possible that a cat can transform itself into a lion. That does happen, however, and in that lies the miracle wrought by the populace of Paris. Moreover, the cat, so despised by Count Angelet, possessed the esteem of the republics of old. In their eyes it was liberty incarnate, and as though to serve as pendant to Minerva Aptera of the Piraeus, there stood on the public square in Corinth the colossal bronze figure of a cat. The ingenious police of the Restoration held the populace of Paris in too rose-coloured a light. It is not so much of an amiable rabble as it is thought. The Parisian is to the Frenchman what the Athenian was to the Greek. No one sleeps more soundly than he. No one is more frankly frivolous and lazy than he. No one can better assume the air of forgetfulness. Let him not be trusted, nevertheless. He is ready for any sort of cool deed, but when there is glory at the end of it, he is worthy of admiration in every sort of fury. Give him a pike, he will produce the 10th of August. Give him a gun, you will have Austerlitz. He is Napoleon's stay and Danton's resource. Is it a question of country? He enlists. Is it a question of liberty? He tears up the pavements. Beware. His hair, filled with wrath, is epic. His blouse drapes itself like the folds of a chlamys. Take care. He will make of the first Rue Grenatot which comes to hand Caudine Forks. When the hour strikes, this man of the faubourgs will grow in stature. This little man will arise, and his gaze will be terrible, and his breath will become a tempest, and there will issue forth from that slender chest enough wind to disarrange the folds of the Alps. It is thanks to the suburban man of Paris that the Revolution, mixed with arms, conquers Europe. He sings. It is his delight. Proportion his song to his nature, and you will see. As long as he has for his refrain nothing but Le Carmagnole, he only overthrows Louis XVI. Make him sing the Marseillaise, and he will free the world. This note, jotted down on the margin of Angéle's report, will return to our four couples. The dinner, as we have said, was drawing to its close. End of Book 3, Chapter 5. Recording by Sarah Williams, Germantown, Maryland.
Gavroche.org. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3, Chapter 6. A chapter in which they adore each other. Chat at table, the chat of love. It is as impossible to reproduce one as the other. The chat of love is a cloud, the chat at table is smoke. Fameuil and Dahlia were humming. Tholomyès was drinking. Zéphine was laughing. Fantine smiling. Listolier blowing a wooden trumpet which he had purchased at St. Cloud. Favourite gazed tenderly at Blachevelle and said, "Blachevelle, I adore you." This calls forth a question from Blachevelle. "What would you do, Favourite, if I were to cease to love you?" "I?" cried Favourite. "Ah, do not say that, even in jest. If you were to cease to love me, I would spring after you. I would scratch you. I should rend you. I would throw you into the water. I would have you arrested." Blachevelle smiled with the voluptuous self-conceit of a man who is tickled in his self-love. Favourite resumed. "Yes, I would scream to the police. Ah, I should not restrain myself, not at all. Rabble." Blachevelle threw himself back in his chair in an ecstasy, and closed both eyes proudly. Dahlia, as she ate, said in a low voice to Favourite, amid the uproar, "So you really idolize him deeply, that Blachevelle of yours?" "I? I detest him," replied Favourite in the same tone, seizing her fork again. "He is avaricious. I love the little fellow opposite me in my house. He is very nice, that young man. Do you know him? One can see that he is an actor by profession. I love actors. As soon as he comes in, his mother says to him, 'Ah, mon Dieu, my peace of mind is gone. There he goes with his shouting. But, my dear, you are splitting my head.' So he goes up to rat-ridden garrets, to black holes as high as he can mount, and there he sets to singing, declaiming, how do I know what, so that he can be heard downstairs. He earns 20 sous a day at the attorney's by penning quibbles. He is the son of a former precentor of Saint Jacques du Haut Pas, and he is very nice. He idolizes me so that one day, when he saw me making batter for some pancakes, he said to me, 'Mademoiselle, make your gloves into fritters, and I will eat them.' It is only artists who can say such things as that. He is very nice. I am in a fair way to go out of my head over that little fellow. Never mind, I tell Blachevelle that I adore him. How I lie, hey? How I do lie." Favourite paused and then went on. "I am sad, you see, Dahlia. It has done nothing but rain all summer. The wind irritates me. The wind does not abate. Blachevelle is very stingy. There are hardly any green peas in the market. One does not know what to eat. I have the spleen, as the English say. Butter is so dear. And then, you see, it is horrible. Here we are dining in a room with a bed in it, and that disgusts me with life." End of Book 3, Chapter 6. Volunteer. please visit LibriVox.org. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3, Chapter 7. The Wisdom of Tholomyès. In the meantime, while some sang, the rest talked together, tumultuously, all at once. It was no longer anything but noise. Tholomyès intervened. "Let us not talk at random, nor too fast," he exclaimed. "Let us reflect if we wish to be brilliant. Too much improvisation empties the mind in a stupid way. Running beer gathers no froth. No haste, gentlemen. Let us mingle majesty with the feast. Let us eat with meditation. Let us make haste slowly. Let us not hurry. Consider the springtime. If it makes haste, it is done for. That is to say, it gets frozen. Excess of zeal ruins peach trees and apricot trees. Excess of zeal kills the grace and the mirth of good dinners. No zeal, gentlemen. Grimod de la Reynière agrees with Talleyrand." A hollow sound of rebellion rumbled through the group. "Leave us in peace, Tholomyès," said Blachevelle. "Down with the tyrant," said Fameuil. "Bombardo, bombance, and bombashell," cried Listolier. "Sunday exists," resumed Fameuil. "We are sober," added Listolier. "Tholomyès," remarked Blachevelle, "contemplate my calmness, Montcalm." "You are the marquis of that," retorted Tholomyès. This mediocre play upon words produced the effect of a stone in a pool. The Marquis de Montcalm was at that time a celebrated royalist. All the frogs held their peace. "Friends," cried Tholomyès with the accent of a man who had recovered his empire, "come to yourself. This pun which has fallen from the skies must not be received with too much stupor. Everything which falls in that way is not necessarily worthy of enthusiasm and respect. The pun is the dung of the mind which soars. The jest falls no matter where, and the mind, after producing a piece of stupidity, plunges into the azure depths. A whitish speck flattened against the rock does not prevent the condor from soaring aloft. Far be it from me to insult the pun. I honor it in proportion to its merits, nothing more. All the most august, the most sublime, the most charming of humanity, and perhaps outside of humanity, have made puns. Jesus Christ made a pun on St. Peter, Moses on Isaac, Ascaris on Polynices, Cleopatra on Octavius. And observe that Cleopatra's pun preceded the battle of Actium, and had it not been for it, no one would have remembered the Greek city of Turin, a Greek name which signifies a ladle. That once conceded, I return to my exhortation. I repeat, brothers, I repeat, no zeal, no hubbub, no excess, even in witticisms, gaiety, jollities, or plays on words. Listen to me. I have the prudence of Amphiaraus and the baldness of Caesar. There must be a limit even to rebuses, et modus in rebus. There must be a limit even to dinners. You are fond of apple turnovers, lady. Do not indulge in them to excess. Even in the matter of turnovers, good sense and art are requisite. Gluttony chastises the glutton, gula punit gulax. Indigestion is charged by the good God with preaching morality to stomachs. And remember this, each one of our passions, even love, has a stomach which must not be filled too full. In all things the word finis must be written in good season. Self-control must be exercised when the matter becomes urgent. The bolt must be drawn on appetite. One must set one's own fantasy to the violin, and carries one's self to the post. The sage is the man who knows how, at a given moment, to effect his own arrest. Have some confidence in me, for I have succeeded to some extent in my study of the law, according to the verdict of my examinations, for I know the difference between the question put and the question pending. For I have sustained a thesis in Latin upon the manner in which torture was administered at Rome at the epoch when Manetius Demens was quaestor of the parricide. Because I am going to be a doctor, apparently, it does not follow that it is absolutely necessary that I should be an imbecile. I recommend you to moderation in your desires. It is true that my name is Felix Tholomyès. I speak well. Happy is he who, when the hour strikes, takes a heroic resolve and abdicates like Scylla or Origenes. Favourite listened with profound attention. "Felix," she said, "what a pretty word! I love that name. It is Latin. It means prosper." Tholomyès went on. "Quirites, gentlemen, caballeros, my friends, do you wish never to feel the prick, to do without the nuptial bed, and to brave love? Nothing more simple. Here is a receipt. Lemonade, exercise, hard labour, work yourself to death, drag blocks, sleep not, hold vigil, gorge yourself with nitrous beverages and portions of nymphaeas, drink emulsion of poppies and agnus castus. Season this with a strict diet, starve yourself, and add thereto cold baths, girdles of herbs, the application of a plate of lead, notions made with a subacetate of lead, and fermentations of oxycrate." "I prefer a woman," said Listolier. "Woman," resumed Tholomyès, "distrust her. Woe to him who yields himself to the unstable heart of woman. Woman is perfidious and disingenuous. She detests the serpent from the professional jealousy. The serpent is the shop over the way." "Tholomyès," cried Blachevelle, "you are drunk." "Pardieu," says Tholomyès. "Then be gay," resumed Blachevelle. "I agree to that," responded Tholomyès, and, refilling his glass, he rose. "Glory to wine, nunc tobacco, canem. Pardon me, ladies, that is Spanish, and the proof of it, signoras, is this: like people, like cask. The arroba of Castile contains 16 litres, the cantara of Alicante 12, the alamud of the Canaries 25, the curtain of the Balearic Isles 26, the boot of Tsar Peter 30. Long live that Tsar who was great, and long live his boot, which was still greater. Ladies, take the advice of a friend. Make a mistake in your neighbour if you see fit. The property of love is to err. A love affair is not made to crouch down and brutalize itself like an English serving maid who has calluses on her knees from scrubbing. It is not made for that. It errs gaily, our gentle love. It has been said, error is human. I say, error is love. Ladies, I idolize you all. Oh, Zéphine, oh, Josephine, face more than irregular. You would be charming were you not all askew. You have the air of a pretty face upon which someone has sat down by mistake. As for Favourite, oh, nymphs and muses! One day when Blachevelle was crossing the gutter in the Rue Guérin-Boisseau, he espied a beautiful girl with white stockings well drawn up, which displayed her legs. This prologue pleased him, and Blachevelle fell in love. The one he loved was Favourite. Oh, Favourite, thou hast Ionian lips. There was a Greek painter named Euphorion, who was surnamed the painter of the lips. That Greek alone would have been worthy to paint thy mouth. Listen, before thee there was never a creature worthy of the name. Thou wert made to receive the apple like Venus, or to eat it like Eve. Beauty begins with thee. I have just referred to Eve. It is thou who hast created her. Thou deservest the letters patent of the beautiful women. Oh, Favourite, I cease to address you as thou, because I pass from poetry to prose. You were speaking of my name a little while ago. That touched me, but let us, whoever we may be, distrust names. They may delude us. I am called Felix, and I am not happy. Words are liars. Let us not blindly accept the indications which they afford us. It would be a mistake to write to Liege for corks, and to Pau for gloves. Miss Dahlia, were I in your place, I would call myself Rosa. A flower should smell sweet, and women should have wit. I say nothing of Fantine. She is a dreamer, a musing, thoughtful, pensive person. She is a phantom possessed of the form of a nymph and the modesty of a nun, who has strayed into the life of a Cosette, but who takes refuge in illusions, and who sings and prays and gazes into the azure without very well knowing what she sees or what she is doing, and who, with her ears fixed on heaven, wanders in a garden where there are more birds than are in existence. Oh, Fantine, know this. I, Tholomyès, I am all illusion, but she does not even hear me, that blonde maid of Cameras. As for the rest, Everything about her is freshness, suavity, youth, sweet morning light. O Fantine, maid worthy of being called Marguerite or Pearl, you are a woman from the beauteous Orient. Ladies, a second piece of advice. Do not marry. Marriage is a graft. It takes well or ill. Avoid that risk. But bah, what am I saying? I am wasting my words. Girls are incurable on the subject of marriage, and all that we wise men can say will not prevent the waistcoat makers and the shoe stitchers from dreaming of husbands studded with diamonds. Well, so be it. But, my beauties, remember this. You eat too much sugar. You have but one fault, O woman, and that is nibbling sugar. O nibbling sex, your pretty little white teeth adore sugar. Now hear me well. Sugar is a salt. All salts are withering. Sugar is the most desiccating of all salts. It sucks the liquids of the blood through the veins. Hence the coagulation, and then the solidification of the blood. Hence tubercles in the lungs. Hence death. That is why diabetes borders on consumption. Then do not crunch sugar, and you will live. I turn to the men. Gentlemen, make conquest. Rob each other of your well-beloved without remorse. Chassez across. In love there are no friends. Everywhere there is a pretty woman, hostility is open. No quarter, war to the death. A pretty woman is a casus belli. A pretty woman is flagrant misdemeanor. All the invasions of history have been determined by petticoats. Woman is man's right. Romulus carried off the Sabines. William carried off the Saxon women. Caesar carried off the Roman women. The man who is not loved soars like a vulture over the mistresses of other men. And for my own part, to all those unfortunate men who are widowers, I throw the sublime proclamation of Bonaparte to the army of Italy. Soldiers, you are in need of everything. The enemy has it. Tholomyès paused. Take breath, Tholomyès, said Blachevelle. At the same moment, Blachevelle, supported by Listolier and Fomé, struck up a plaintive air, one of those stupid studio songs composed of the first words which come to hand, rhymed richly and not at all, as destitute of sense as the gesture of the tree, and the sounds of the wind which have their birth in the vapour of pipes, and are dissipated and take their flight with them. This is the couplet by which the group replied to Tholomyès' harangue. The father turkey cock so grave some money to an agent gave. That master, good Clement Tonnerre, might be made Pope on St. John's Day fair. But this good Clement could not be made Pope, because no priest was he. And then their agent, whose wrath burned, with all their money back returned. This was not calculated to calm Tholomyès' improvisation. He emptied his glass, filled, refilled it, and began again. Down with wisdom, forget that all I have said. Let us be neither prudes, nor prudent men, nor prud'hommes. I propose a toast to mirth. Be merry, let us complete our course of law by folly and eating, indigestion and the digest. Let Justinian be the male, and feasting the female. Joy in the depth. Live, O creation. The world is a great diamond. I am happy. The birds are astonishing. What a festival everywhere. The nightingale is a gratuitous Ellevier. Summer, I salute thee. O Luxembourg, O Georgics of the Rue Madame and of the Allée de l'Observatoire. O pensive infantry soldiers, or all those charming nurses who, while they guard the children, amuse themselves. The pampas of America would please me if I had not the arcades of the Odeon. My soul flits away into the virgin forests and to the savannas. All is beautiful. The flies buzz in the sun has sneezed out the hummingbird. Embrace me, Fantine. He made a mistake and embraced Favourite. End of Book 3, Chapter 7.
Please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Miel. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 3. The House in the Rue Plumet. Chapter 8. the death of a horse. The dinners are better at Eden's than at Bombarda's, exclaimed Zéphine. I prefer Bombarda to Eden, declared Blachevelle. There is more luxury, it is more Asiatic. Look at the room downstairs. There are mirrors, glazes, on the walls. I prefer them, glazes, ices. On my plate, said Favourite. Blachevelle persisted. Look at the knives. The handles are of silver at Bombarda's, and of bone at Eden's. Now, silver is more valuable than bone. Except for those who have a silver chin, observed Tholomyès. He was looking at the dome of the Invalides, which was visible from Bombarda's windows. A pause ensued. Tholomyès, exclaimed Fameux. Listolier and I were having a discussion just now. A discussion is a good thing, replied Tholomyès. A quarrel is better. We are disputing about philosophy. Well, which you prefer, Descartes or Spinoza? Listolier, said Tholomyès. This decree pronounced, he took a drink, and went on. I consent to live. All is not at an end on earth, since we can still talk nonsense, for there I return thanks to the immortal gods. We lie. One lies, but one laughs. One affirms, but one doubts. The unexpected bursts forth from the syllogism. That is fine. There are still human beings here below who know how to open and close the surprise box of a paradox merrily. This, ladies, which you are drinking with so tranquil an air, is Madeira wine, you must know, from the vineyard of Corral de Schreiersch, which is 317 fathoms above the level of the sea. Attention while you drink. 317 fathoms. And Monsieur Bombarda, the magnificent eating-house keeper, gives you those 317 fathoms for 4 francs and 50 centimes. Again Fameux interrupted him. Your opinions fix the law. Who is your favourite author? Père? Gon? No, Chou. And Tholomyès continued. Honour to Bombarda. He would equal Monophis of Elephanta, if he could but get me an Indian dancing girl, and Dugillion of Cheironia, if he could bring me a Greek courtesan. For, oh ladies, there were Bombardas in Greece and in Egypt. Apuleius tells of them. Alas, always the same, nothing more unpublished by the Creator and creation. Nil sub sole novum, says Solomon. Amor omnibus idem, says Virgil, and Carabine mounts with Caraban into a bark of Saint Cloud, as Aspasia embarked with Pericles upon the fleet at Samos. One last word. Do you know what Aspasia was, ladies? Although she lived at an epoch where women had, as yet, no soul, she was a soul of rosy and purple hue, more ardent hue than fire, fresher than the dawn. Aspasia was a creature in whom 2 extremes of womanhood met. She was a goddess prostitute, Socrates plus Menelescu. Aspasia was created in case a mistress should be needed for Prometheus. Tholomyès, once started, would have found some difficulty in stopping, had not a horse fallen down upon the quay just at that moment. The shock caused the cart and the orator to come to a dead halt. It was a Beauceron mare, old and thin, and one fit for the necker, which was dragging a very heavy cart. On arriving in front of Bombarda's, the worn-out, exhausted beast had refused to proceed any further. This incident attracted a crowd. Hardly had the cursing and indignant carter had time to utter with proper energy the sacramental word, "Matin," the jade backed up, with a pitiless cut of a whip, when the jade fell, never to rise again. On hearing the hubbub made by the passers-by, Tholomyès' merry auditors turned their heads, and Tholomyès took advantage of the opportunity to bring his elocution to a close with his melancholy strophe. Elle était de ce monde où couscous et carrosse ont le même destin, et rose, elle a vécu ce que vivant les roses, l'espace d'un matin. Poor horse, sighed Fantine, and Dahlia exclaimed, There's Fantine on the point of crying over horses. How can one be such a pitiful fool as that? At that moment, Favourite, holding her arms and throwing her head back, looked resolutely at Tholomyès and said, Come, now, the surprise? Exactly. The moment has arrived, replied Tholomyès. Gentlemen, the hour for giving these ladies a surprise has struck. Wait for us a moment, ladies. It begins with a kiss, said Blachevelle. On the brow, added Tholomyès, Each gravely bestowed a kiss on his mistress's brow, then all four filed out through the door, with their fingers on their lips. Favourite clapped her hands on their departure. "It's beginning to be amusing already," said she. "Don't be too long," murmured Fantine. "We are waiting for you." End of Book Third, Chapter 8.
Recording by Jordan. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo, Book Third, in the year 1817, Chapter 9, A Merry End to Mirth. When the young girls were left alone, they leaned, 2 by 2, on the window-sills, chatting, craning out their heads, and talking from one window to the other. They saw the young men emerge from the Café Bombarda, arm in arm. The latter turned round, made signs to them, smiled, and disappeared in that dusty Sunday throng which makes a weekly invasion into the Champs-Élysées. "Don't be long," cried Fantine. "What are they going to bring us?" said Zéphine. "It will certainly be something pretty," said Dahlia. "For my part," said Favourite, "I want it to be of gold." Their attention was soon distracted by the movements on the shore of the lake, which they could see through the branches of the large trees, and which diverted them greatly. It was the hour for the departure of the mail coaches and diligences. Nearly all the stage coaches for the south and west passed through the Champs-Élysées. The majority followed the quay, and went through the Passy barrier. From moment to moment some huge vehicle, painted yellow and black, heavily loaded, noisily harnessed, rendered shapeless by trunks, tarpaulins, and valises, full of heads which immediately disappeared, rushed through the crowd with all the sparks of a forge, with dust for smoke, and an air of fury, grinding the pavement, changing all the paving stones into steels. This uproar delighted the young girls. Favourite exclaimed, "What a row! One would say that it was a pile of chains flying away." It chanced that one of these vehicles, which they could only see with difficulty through the thick elms, halted for a moment, then set out again at a gallop. This surprised Fantine. "That's odd," said she. "I thought the diligence never stopped." Favourite shrugged her shoulders. "This Fantine is surprising. I am coming to take a look at her out of curiosity. She is dazzled by the simplest things. Suppose a case. I am a traveller. I say to the diligence, 'I will go on in advance. You shall pick me up on the quay as you pass.' The diligence passes, sees me, halts, and takes me. That is done every day. You do not know life, my dear." In this manner a certain time elapsed. All at once Favourite made a movement like a person who is just waking up. "Well," said she, "and the surprise?" "Yes, by the way," joined in Dahlia, "the famous surprise?" "They are a very long time about it," said Fantine. As Fantine concluded this sigh, the waiter who had served them at dinner entered. He held in his hand something which resembled a letter. "What is that?" demanded Favourite. The waiter replied, "It is a paper that those gentlemen left for these ladies." "Why did you not bring it at once?" "Because," said the waiter, "the gentleman ordered me not to deliver it to the ladies for an hour." Favourite snatched the paper from the waiter's hand. It was, in fact, a letter. "Stop," said she. "There is no address, but this is what is written on it. 'This is the surprise.'" She tore the letter open hastily, opened it, and read. She knew how to read. "Our beloved, you must know that we have parents. Parents, you do not know much about such things. They are called fathers and mothers by the civil code, which is puerile and honest. Now, these parents groan, these old folks implore us, these good men and these good women call us prodigal sons. They desire our return, and offer to kill calves for us. Being virtuous, we obey them. At the hour when you read this, 5 fiery horses will be bearing us to our papas and mammas. We are pulling up our stakes, as Bossuet says. We are going, we are gone. We flee in the arms of Lafitte, and on the wings of Caillard. The Toulouse diligence tears us from the abyss, and the abyss is you, O our little beauties. We return to society, to duty, to respectability, at full trot, at the rate of 3 leagues an hour. It is necessary for the good of the country that we should be, like the rest of the world, prefects, fathers of families, rural police, and councillors of state. Venerate us, we are sacrificing ourselves. Mourn for us in haste, and replace us with speed. If this letter lacerates you, do the same by it. Adieu. For the space of nearly 2 years we have made you happy. We bear you no grudge for that. Signed, Blachevelle, Famuel, Listoyer, Felix Tholomyès. Postscriptum. The dinner is paid for. The 4 young women looked at each other. Favourite was the first to break the silence. "Well," she exclaimed, "it's a very pretty farce all the same." "It is very droll," said Zéphine. "That must have been Blachevelle's idea," resumed Favourite. "It makes me in love with him. No sooner is he gone than he is loved. This is an adventure indeed." "No," said Dahlia. "It was one of Tholomyès' ideas. That is evident." "In that case," retorted Favourite, "death to Blachevelle, and long live Tholomyès." "Long live Tholomyès!" exclaimed Dahlia and Zéphine, and they burst out laughing. Fantine laughed with the rest. An hour later, when she had returned to her room, she wept. It was her first love affair, as we have said. She had given herself to this Tholomyès as to a husband, and the poor girl had a child. End of Book 3, Chapter 9. Recording by Jordan.
Audiobooks.org. Recording by Melissa. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 4th. To confide is sometimes to deliver into a person's power. Chapter 1. One mother meets another mother. There was at Montfermeil, near Paris, during the first quarter of this century, a sort of cook-shop which no longer exists. This cook-shop was kept by some people named Thénardier, husband and wife. It was situated in Boulanger Lane. Over the door there was a board nailed flat against the wall. Upon this board was painted something which resembled a man carrying another man on his back, the latter wearing the big gilt epaulets of a general, with large silver stars. Red spots represented blood, the rest of the picture consisted of smoke, and probably represented a battle. Below ran this inscription: "At the sign of Sergeant of Waterloo. Au Sergent de Waterloo." Nothing is more common than a cart or a truck at the door of a hostelry. Nevertheless, the vehicle, or to speak more accurately, the fragment of a vehicle, which encumbered the street in front of the cook-shop of the Sergeant of Waterloo, one evening in the spring of 1818, would certainly have attracted by its mass the attention of any painter who had passed that way. It was the fore-carriage of one of those trucks which are used in wooded tracts of country, and which serve to transport thick planks and the trunks of trees. This fore-carriage was composed of a massive iron axle-tree with a pivot, into which was fitted a heavy shaft, and which was supported by 2 huge wheels. The whole thing was compact, overwhelming, and misshapen. It seemed like the gun-carriage of an enormous cannon. The ruts of the road had bestowed on the wheels, the fellies, the hub, the axle, and the shaft, a layer of mud, a hideous yellowish daubing hue, tolerably like that with which people are fond of ornamenting cathedrals. The wood was disappearing under mud, and the iron beneath rust. Under the axle-tree hung, like drapery, a huge chain, worthy of some Goliath of a convict. This chain suggested, not the beams, which it was its office to transport, but the mastodons and mammoths which it might have served to harness. It had the air of the galleys, but of cyclopean and superhuman galleys, and it seemed to have been detached from some monster. Homer would have bound Polyphemus with it, and Shakespeare, Caliban. Why was that fore-carriage of a truck in that place in the street? In the first place, to encumber the street; next, in order that it might finish the process of rusting. There is a throng of institutions in the old social order which one comes across in this fashion as one walks about outdoors, and which have no other reasons for existence than the above. The centre of the chain swung very near the ground in the middle, and in the loop, as in the rope of a swing, there were seated and grouped, on that particular evening, in exquisite interlacement, two little girls, one about 2½ years old, the other 18 months, the younger in the arms of the other. A handkerchief, cleverly knotted about them, prevented their falling out. A mother had caught sight of that frightful chain, and had said, "Come, there's a plaything for my children." The two children, who were dressed prettily and with some elegance, were radiant with pleasure. One would have said that they were two roses amid old iron. Their eyes were a triumph. Their fresh cheeks were full of laughter. One had chestnut hair, the other brown. Their innocent faces were two delighted surprises. A blossoming shrub which grew near wafted to the passers-by perfumes which seemed to emanate from them. The child of 18 months displayed her pretty little bare stomach with the chaste indecency of childhood. Above and around these two delicate heads, all made of happiness and steeped in light, a giant fore-carriage, black with rust, almost terrible, all entangled in curves and wild angles, rose in a vault like the entrance of a cavern. A few paces apart, crouching down upon the threshold of the hostelry, the mother, not a very prepossessing woman, by the way, though touching at that moment, was swinging the two children by means of a long cord, watching them carefully for fear of accidents, with that animal and celestial expression which is peculiar to maternity. At every backward and forward swing the hideous lynx emitted a strident sound which resembled a cry of rage. The little girls were in ecstasies. The setting sun mingled in this joy, and nothing could be more charming than this caprice of chance which had made a chain of Titans the swing of cherubim. As she rocked her little ones, the mother hummed in a discordant voice a romance then celebrated. "It must be," said the warrior. Her song and the contemplation of her daughters prevented her hearing and seeing what was going on in the street. In the meantime, some one had approached her, as she was beginning the first couplet of the romance, and suddenly she heard a voice saying very near her ear, "You have two beautiful children there, madame." "To the fair and tender Imogene," replied the mother, continuing her romance. Then she turned her head. A woman stood before her, a few paces distant. This woman also had a child, which she carried in her arms. She was carrying, in addition, a large carpet-bag, which seemed very heavy. This woman's child was one of the most divine creatures that it was possible to behold. It was a girl, 2 or 3 years of age. She could have entered into competition with the other two little ones, so far as the coquetry of her dress was concerned. She wore a cap of fine linen, ribbons on her bodice, and Valenciennes lace in her cap. The folds of her skirt were raised so as to permit a view of her white, firm, and dimpled leg. She was admirably rosy and healthy. The little beauty inspired a desire to take a bite from the apples of her cheeks. Of her eyes nothing could be known, except that they must be very large and that they had magnificent lashes. She was asleep. She slept with that slumber of absolute confidence peculiar to her age. The arms of mothers are made of tenderness. In them children sleep profoundly. As for the mother, her appearance was sad and poverty-stricken. She was dressed like a working woman who is inclined to turn into a peasant again. She was young. Was she handsome? Perhaps, but in that attire it was not apparent. Her hair, a golden lock of which had escaped, seemed very thick, but it was severely concealed beneath an ugly, tight, close, nun-like cap tied under the chin. A smile displays beautiful teeth when one has them, but she did not smile. Her eyes did not seem to have been dry for a very long time. She was pale. She had a very weary and rather sickly appearance. She gazed upon her daughter asleep in her arms with the air peculiar to a mother who has nursed her own child. A large blue handkerchief, such as the Invalides use, was folded into a fichu and concealed her figure clumsily. Her hands were sunburnt and all dotted with freckles. Her forefinger was hardened and lacerated with a needle. She wore a cloak of coarse brown woolen stuff, a linen gown, and coarse shoes. It was Fantine. It was Fantine, but difficult to recognize. Nevertheless, on scrutinizing her attentively, it was evident that she still retained her beauty. A melancholy fold, which resembled the beginning of irony, wrinkled her right cheek. As for her toilette, that aerial toilette of muslin and ribbons, which seemed made of mirth, of folly, and of music, full of bells and perfumed with lilacs, had vanished like that beautiful and dazzling hoar-frost which is mistaken for diamonds in the sunlight. It melts and leaves the branch quite black. 10 months had elapsed since the pretty farce. What had taken place during those 10 months? It can be divined. After abandonment, strange circumstances. Fantine had immediately lost sight of Favourite, Zéphine, and Dahlia. The bond once broken on the side of the men, it was loosened between the women. They would have been greatly astonished had any one of them told them a fortnight later that they had been friends. There no longer existed any reason for such a thing. Fantine had remained alone, the father of her child gone. Alas! such ruptures are irrevocable. She found herself absolutely isolated, minus the habit of work, and plus the taste for pleasure. Drawn away by her liaison with Tholomyès, to disdain the pretty trade which she knew, she had neglected to keep her market open. It was now closed to her. She had no resource. Fantine barely knew how to read, and did not know how to write. In her childhood she had only been taught to sign her name. She had a public letter writer indite an epistle to Tholomyès, then a second, then a third. Tholomyès replied to none of them. Fantine heard the gossips say, as they looked at her child, "Who takes those children seriously? One only shrugs one's shoulders over such children." Then she thought of Tholomyès, who had shrugged his shoulders over his child, and who did not take that innocent being seriously, and her heart grew gloomy towards that man. But what was she to do? She no longer knew to whom to apply. She had committed a fault, but the foundation of her nature, as will be remembered, was modesty and virtue. She was vaguely conscious that she was on the verge of falling into distress and of gliding into a worse state. Courage was necessary. She possessed it, and held herself firm. The idea of returning to her native town of M. sur M. occurred to her. There, some one might possibly know her and give her work. Yes, but it would be necessary to conceal her fault. In a confused way she perceived the necessity of a separation, which would be more painful than the first one. Her heart contracted, but she took her resolution. Fantine, as we shall see, had the fierce bravery of life. She had already valiantly renounced finery, had dressed herself in linen, and had put all her silks, all her ornaments, all her ribbons, and all her laces on her daughter, the only vanity which was left to her, and a holy one it was. She sold all that she had, which produced for her 200 francs. Her little debts paid, she had only about 80 francs left. At the age of 22, on a beautiful spring morning, she quitted Paris, bearing her child on her back. Anyone who had seen these two pass would have had pity on them. This woman had in all the world nothing but her child, and the child had in all the world no one but this woman. Fantine had nursed her child, and this had tired her chest, and she coughed a little. We shall have no further occasion to speak of Monsieur Félix Tholomyès. Let us confine ourselves to saying that 20 years later, under King Louis Philippe, he was a great provincial lawyer, wealthy, influential, a wise elector, and a very severe juryman. He was still a man of pleasure. Towards the middle of the day, after having from time to time, for the sake of resting herself, travelled, for 3 or 4 sous a league, in what was then known as the petite voiture des environs de Paris, the little suburban coach service, Fantine found herself at Montfermeil, in the alley of Boulanger. As she passed the Thénardier hostelry, the two little girls, blissful in the monster swing, had dazzled her in a manner, and she had halted in front of that vision of joy. Charms exist. These two little girls were a charm to this mother. She gazed at them in much emotion. The presence of angels is an announcement of paradise. She thought that, above the sin, she beheld the mysterious here of Providence. These two little creatures were evidently happy. She gazed at them, she admired them, in such emotion that at the moment when their mother was recovering her breath between 2 couplets of her song, she could not refrain from addressing to her the remark which we have just read. "You have 2 pretty children, madame." The most ferocious creatures are disarmed by caresses bestowed on their young. The mother raised her head and thanked her, and bade the wayfarer sit down on the bench at the door, she herself being seated on the threshold. The two women began to chat. "My name is Madame Thénardier," said the mother of the two little girls. "We keep this inn." Then, her mind still running on her romance, she continued humming between her teeth, "It must be so, I am a knight, and I am off to Palestine." This Madame Thénardier was a sandy complexioned woman, thin and angular, the type of the soldier's wife in all its unpleasantness, and what was odd, with a languishing air which she owed to her perusal of romances. She was a simpering but masculine creature. Old romances produce that effect when rubbed against the imagination of cook-shop women. She was still young; she was barely 30. If this crouching woman had stood upright, Her lofty stature and her frame of an perambulating colossus suitable for fairs might have frightened the traveller at the outset, troubled her confidence, and disturbed what caused what we have to relate to vanish. A person who is seated instead of standing erect, destinies hang upon such a thing as that. The traveller told her story with slight modifications: that she was a working woman, that her husband was dead, that her work in Paris had failed her, and that she was on her way to seek it elsewhere in her own native parts; that she had left Paris that morning on foot; that as she was carrying her child and felt fatigued, she had got into the Villemomble coach when she met it; that from Villemomble she had come to Montfermeil on foot; that the little one had walked a little, but not much, because she was so young, and that she had been obliged to take her up, and the jewel had fallen asleep. At this word she bestowed on her daughter a passionate kiss, which woke her. The child opened her eyes, great blue eyes like her mother's, and looked at—what? Nothing, with that serious and sometimes severe air of little children, which is a mystery of their luminous innocence in the presence of our twilight of virtue. One would say that they feel themselves to be angels, and that they know us to be men. Then the child began to laugh, and although the mother held fast to her, she slipped to the ground with the unconquerable energy of a little being which wished to run. All at once she caught sight of the two others in the swing, stopped short, and put out her tongue in sign of admiration. Mother Thénardier released her daughters, made them descend from the swing, and said, "Now amuse yourselves, all three of you." Children become acquainted quickly at that age, and at the expiration of a minute the little Thénardier were playing with a newcomer and making holes in the dirt, which was an immense pleasure. The newcomer was very gay. The goodness of the mother was written in the gayety of the child. She had seized a scrap of wood which served for a shovel, and energetically dug a cavity big enough for a fly. The gravedigger's business becomes a subject for laughter when performed by a child. The two women pursued their chat. "What is your little one's name?" "Cosette." "For Cosette, read Euphrasie." The child's name was Euphrasie, but out of Euphrasie the mother had made Cosette by that sweet and graceful instinct of mothers and of the populace, which changes Josepha into Pepita and Françoise into Salette. It is a sort of derivative which disarranges and disconcerts the whole science of etymologies. We have known a grandmother who succeeded in turning Theodore into Non. "How old is she?" "She's going on 3." "That's the age of my eldest." In the meantime, the three little girls were grouped in an attitude of profound anxiety and blissfulness. An event had happened. A big worm had emerged from the ground, and they were afraid, and they were in ecstasies over it. Their radiant brows touched each other. One would have said that there were 3 hoods in one aureole. "How easily children get acquainted at once!" exclaimed Mother Thénardier. "One would swear that they were 3 sisters." This remark was probably the spark which the other mother had been waiting for. She seized the Thénardier's hand, looked at her fixedly, and said, "Will you keep my child for me?" The Thénardier made one of those movements of surprise which signify neither assent nor refusal. Cosette's mother continued, "You see, I cannot take my daughter to the country; my work will not permit it. With a child one can find no situation. People are ridiculous in the country. It was the good God who caused me to pass your inn. When I caught sight of your little ones, so pretty, so clean, and so happy, it overwhelmed me. I said, 'Here is a good mother. That is just the thing, they will make 3 sisters. And then it will not be long before I return. Will you keep my child for me?' 'I must see about it,' replied the Thénardier. 'I will give you 6 francs a month.' Here a man's voice called from the depths of the cook shop, 'Not for less than 7 francs, and 6 months paid in advance.' 6 times 7 makes 42, said the Thénardier. 'I will give it,' said the mother. 'And 15 francs in addition for preliminary expenses,' added the man's voice. 'Total, 57 francs,' said Madame Thénardier, and she hummed vaguely with these figures. 'It must be,' said the warrior. 'I will pay it,' said the mother. 'I have 80 francs. I shall have enough left to reach the country by travelling on foot. I shall earn money there, and as soon as I have a little I will return for my darling.' The man's voice resumed. 'The little one has an outfit?' 'That is my husband,' said the Thénardier. 'Of course she has an outfit, the poor treasure.' I understood perfectly that it was your husband. 'And a beautiful outfit, too. A senseless outfit, everything by the dozen, and silk gowns like a lady. It is here in my carpet bag.' 'You must hand it over,' struck in the man's voice again. 'Of course I shall give it to you,' said the mother. 'It would be very queer if I were to leave my daughter quite naked.' The master's face appeared. 'That's good,' he said. The bargain was concluded. The mother passed the night at the inn, gave up her money, and left her child, fastened her carpet-bag once more, now reduced in volume by the removal of the outfit and light henceforth, and set out on the following morning, intending to return soon. People arrange such departures tranquilly, but they are despairs. A neighbor of the Thénardier met this mother as she was setting out, and came back with the remark: "I have just seen a woman crying in the street so that it was enough to rend your heart." When Cosette's mother had taken her departure, the man said to the woman:— "That will serve to pay my note for 110 francs which falls due to-morrow. I lacked 50 francs. Do you know that I should have had a bailiff and a protest after me? You played the mousetrap nicely with your young ones." "Without suspecting it," said the woman. End of Book 4, Chapter 1. Recording by Melissa. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book Fourth. To confide is sometimes to deliver into a person's power. Chapter 2. First sketch of two unprepossessing figures. The mouse which has been caught was a frightful specimen, but the cat rejoices even over a lean mouse. Who were these Thénardier? Let us say a word or two of them now. We will complete the sketch later on. These beings belong to that bastard class composed of coarse people who have been successful, and of intelligent people who have descended in the scale, which is between the class called middle and the class denominated as inferior, and which combines some of the defects of the second with nearly all of the vices of the first, without possessing the generous impulse of the workingman nor the honest order of the bourgeois. They were of those dwarfed natures which, if a dull fire chances to warm them up, easily become monstrous. There was in the woman a substratum of the brute, and in the man the material for a blackguard. Both were susceptible, in the highest degree, of the sort of hideous progress which is accomplished in the direction of evil. There exist crab-like souls which are continually retreating towards the darkness, retrograding in life rather than advancing, employing experience to augment their deformity, growing incessantly worse, and becoming more and more impregnated with an ever-augmenting blackness. This man and woman possessed such souls. Thénardier, in particular, was troublesome for a physiognomist. One can only look at some men to distrust them, for one feels that they are dark in both directions. They are uneasy in the rear and threatening in front. There is something of the unknown about them. One can no more answer for what they have done than for what they will do. The shadow which they bear in their glance denounces them. From merely hearing them utter a word or seeing them make a gesture, one obtains a glimpse of sombre secrets in their past and of sombre mysteries in their future. This Thénardier, if he himself was to be believed, had been a soldier, a sergeant, he said. He had probably been through the campaign of 1815, and had even conducted himself with tolerable valor, it would seem. We shall see later on how much truth there was in this. The sign of his hostelry was an allusion to one of his feats of arms. He had painted it himself, for he knew how to do a little of everything, and badly. It was at the epoch when the ancient classical romance, which after having been Célier, was no longer anything but Lodoïska, still noble, but ever more and more vulgar, having fallen from Mademoiselle de Scudéry to Madame Bournon Malarme, and from Madame de Lafayette to Madame Barthélemy Hadot, was setting the loving hearts of the portresses of Paris aflame, and even ravaging the suburbs to some extent. Madame Thénardier was just intelligent enough to read this sort of books. She lived on them. In them she drowned what brains she possessed. This had given her, when very young, and even a little later, a sort of pensive attitude towards her husband, a scamp of a certain depth, a ruffian lettered to the same extent of the grammar, coarse and fine at one and the same time, but so fine as sensationalism was concerned, given to the perusal of Pigault Lebrun, and in what concerns the sex, as he said in his jargon, a downright unmitigated lout. His wife was 12 or 15 years younger than he was. Later on, when her hair, arranged in a romantically drooping fashion, began to grow gray, when the Megara began to be developed from the Pamela, the female Thénardier was nothing but a coarse, vicious woman who had dabbled in stupid romances. Now, one cannot read nonsense with impunity. The result was that her eldest daughter was named Éponine. As for the younger, the poor little thing came near being called Gulnare. I know to what diversion, affected by a romance of Ducray Duménil, she owed the fact that she merely bore the name of Azelma. However, we will remark by the way, Everything was not ridiculous and superficial in that curious epoch to which we are alluding, and which may be designated as the anarchy of baptismal names. By the side of this romantic element which we have just indicated, there is the social symptom. It is not rare for the neatherd's boy nowadays to bear the name of Arthur, Alfred, or Alphonse, and for the vicomte, if there are still any vicomtes, to be called Thomas, Pierre, or Jacques. This displacement, which places the elegant name on the plebeian and the rustic name on the aristocrat, is nothing else than an eddy of equality. The irresistible penetration of the new inspiration is there as everywhere else. Beneath this apparent discord there is a great and profound thing, the French Revolution. End of Book 4, Chapter 2. Recording by Melissa. .org. Recording by Melissa. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 4th. To confide is sometimes to deliver into a person's power. Chapter 3. The Lark. It is not all in all sufficient to be wicked in order to prosper. The cook-shop was in a bad way. Thanks to the traveller's 57 francs, Thénardier had been able to avoid a protest and to honor his signature. On the following month they were again in need of money. The woman took Cosette's outfit to Paris and pawned it at the pawnbroker's for 60 francs. As soon as that sum was spent, the Thénardier grew accustomed to look on the little girl merely as a child whom they were caring for out of charity, and they treated her accordingly. As she had no longer any clothes, they dressed her in the cast-off petticoats and chemises of the Thénardier brats, that is to say, in rags. They fed her on what all the rest had left, a little better than the dog, a little worse than the cat. Moreover, the cat and dog were her habitual table companions. Cosette ate with them under the table from a wooden bowl similar to theirs. The mother, who had established herself, as we shall see later on, at Montreuil-sur-Mer, wrote, or more correctly caused to be written, a letter every month, that she might have news of her child. The Thénardier replied invariably, "Cosette is doing wonderfully well." At the expiration of the first 6 months, the mother sent 7 francs for the 7th month, and continued her remittances with tolerable regularity from month to month. The year was not completed when Thénardier said, "A fine favor she is doing us, in sooth. What does she expect us to do with her 7 francs?" And he wrote to demand 12 francs. The mother, whom they had persuaded into the belief that her child was happy and was coming on well, submitted and forwarded the 12 francs. Certain natures cannot love on the one hand without hating on the other. Mother Thénardier loved her 2 daughters passionately, which caused her to hate the stranger. It is sad to think that the love of a mother can possess villainous aspects. Little as was the space occupied by Cosette, it seemed to her as though it were taken from her own, and that that little child diminished the air which her daughters breathed. This woman, like many women of her sort, had a load of caresses and a burden of blows and injuries to dispense each day. If she had not had Cosette, it is certain that her daughters, idolized as they were, would have received the whole of it. But the stranger did them the service to divert the blows to herself. Her daughters received nothing but caresses. Cosette could not make a motion which would not draw down upon her head a heavy shower of violent blows and unmerited chastisement. The sweet, feeble being, who should not have understood anything of this world or of God, incessantly punished, scolded, ill-used, beaten, and seeing beside her 2 little creatures like herself, who lived in a ray of dawn. Madame Thénardier was vicious with Cosette. Éponine and Azelma were vicious. Children at that age are only copies of their mother. The size is smaller, that is all. A year passed, then another. People in the village said, "Those Thénardier are good people. They are not rich, and yet they are bringing up a poor child who was abandoned on their hands." They thought that Cosette's mother had forgotten her. In the meanwhile, Thénardier having learned, it was impossible to say by what obscure means, that the child was probably a bastard, and that the mother could not acknowledge it, exacted 15 francs a month, saying that the creature was growing and eating, and threatened to send her away. "Let her not bother me," he exclaimed, "or I'll fire her brat right into the middle of her secrets. I must have an increase." The mother paid the 15 francs. From year to year the child grew, and so did her wretchedness. As long as Cosette was little, she was the scapegoat of the 2 other children. As soon as she began to develop a little, that is to say, before she was even 5 years old, she became the servant of the household. 5 years old, the reader will say, That is not probable. Alas, it is true. Social suffering begins at all ages. Have we not recently seen the trial of a man named Domelard, an orphan turned bandit, who at the age of 5, as the official documents state, being alone in the world, worked for his living and stole? Cosette was made to run on errands, to sweep the rooms, the courtyard, the street, to wash the dishes, to even carry burdens. The Thénardiers considered themselves all the more authorized to behave in this manner, since the mother, who was still at Montreuil-sur-Mer, had become irregular in her payments. Some months she was in arrears. If this mother had returned to Montfermeil at the end of these 3 years, she would not have recognized her child. Cosette, so pretty and rosy on her arrival in that house, was now thin and pale. She had an indescribably uneasy look. The sly creature, said the Thénardier. Injustice had made her peevish, and misery had made her ugly. Nothing remained to her except her beautiful eyes, which inspired pain, because large as they were, it seemed as though one beheld in them a still larger amount of sadness. It was a heart-breaking thing to see this poor child, not yet 6 years old, shivering in the winter in her old rags of linen, full of holes, sweeping the street before daylight, with an enormous broom in her tiny red hands and a tear in her great eyes. She was called the Lark in the neighborhood. The populace, who are fond of these figures of speech, had taken a fancy to bestow this name on this trembling, frightened, and shivering little creature, no bigger than a bird, who was awake every morning before any one else in the house or the village, and was always in the street or the fields before daybreak. Only the little lark never sang. End of Book 4, Chapter 3. Recording by Melissa.
LibriVox.org. Recording by Joel Portinga. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book the 5th, The Descent. Chapter 1. The History of a Progress in Black Glass Trinkets. And in the meantime, what had become of that mother, who, according to the people at Montfermeil, seemed to have abandoned her child? Where was she? What was she doing? After leaving her little Cosette with the Thénardiers, she had continued her journey, and had reached Montreuil-sur-Mer. This, it will be remembered, was in 1818. Fantine had quitted her province 10 years before. Montreuil-sur-Mer had changed its aspect. While Fantine had been slowly descending from wretchedness to wretchedness, her native town had prospered. About 2 years previously, one of those industrial facts which are the grand events of small districts had taken place. This detail is important, and we regard it as useful to develop it at length, we should almost say to underline it. From time immemorial, Montreuil-sur-Mer had had for its special industry the imitation of English jet and the black glass trinkets of Germany. This industry had always vegetated on account of the high price of the raw material, which reacted on the manufacture. At the moment when Fantine returned to Montreuil-sur-Mer, an unheard-of transformation had taken place in the production of black goods. Towards the close of 1815, a man, a stranger, had established himself in the town, and had been inspired with the idea of substituting, in this manufacture, gum-lac for resin, and, for bracelets in particular, slides of sheet-iron simply laid together for slides of soldered sheet-iron. This very small change had effected a revolution. This very small change had, in fact, prodigiously reduced the cost of the raw material, which had rendered it possible, in the first place, to raise the price of manufacture, a benefit to the country; in the second place, to improve the workmanship, an advantage to the consumer; in the third place, to sell at a lower price while trebling the profit, which was a benefit to the manufacturer. Thus 3 results ensued from one idea. In less than 3 years the inventor of this process had become rich, which is good, and had made everyone about him rich, which is better. He was a stranger in the department. Of his origin nothing was known. Of the beginning of his career, very little. It was rumored that he had come to town with very little money, a few hundred francs at the most. It was from this slender capital, enlisted in the service of an ingenious idea, developed by method and thought, that he had drawn his own fortune, and the fortune of the whole countryside. On his arrival at Montreuil-sur-Mer, he had only the garments, the appearance, and the language of a working-man. It appears that on the very day when he made his obscure entry into the little town of M. just at nightfall, on a December evening, knapsack on back and thorn club in hand, a large fire had broken out in the town hall. This man had rushed into the flames and saved, at the risk of his own life, 2 children who belonged to the captain of the gendarmerie. This is why they had forgotten to ask him for his passport. Afterwards they had learned his name. He was called Father Madeleine. End of Book 5, Chapter 1. .org. Recorded by Joel Portinga. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 5, The Descent. Chapter 2, Madeleine. He was a man about 50 years of age, who had a preoccupied air, and who was good. That was all that could be said about him. Thanks to the rapid progress of the industry which he had so admirably reconstructed, Montreuil-sur-Mer had become a rather important centre of trade. Spain, which consumes a good deal of black jet, made enormous purchases there each year. Montreuil-sur-Mer almost rivaled London and Berlin in this branch of commerce. Father Madeleine's profits were such that at the end of the second year he was able to erect a large factory, in which there were 2 vast workrooms, one for the men and the other for women. Anyone who was hungry could present himself there, and was sure of finding employment and bread. Father Madeleine required of the men good will, and of the women pure morals, and of all probity. He had separated the workrooms in order to separate the sexes, and so that the women and girls might remain discreet. On this point he was inflexible. It was the only thing in which he was in a manner intolerant. He was all the more firmly set on this severity, since Montreuil-sur-Mer, being a garrison town, opportunities for corruption abounded. However, his coming had been a boon, and his presence was a godsend. Before Father Madeleine's arrival, everything had languished in the country. Now everything lived with a healthy life of toil. A strong circulation warmed everything and penetrated everywhere. Slack seasons and wretchedness were unknown. There was no pocket so obscure that it had not a little money in it, no dwelling so lowly that there was not some little joy within it. Father Madeleine gave employment to everyone. He exacted but one thing: be an honest man, be an honest woman. As we have said, in the midst of this activity, of which he was the cause and the pivot, Father Madeleine made his fortune, but a singular thing in a simple man of business, it did not seem as though that were his chief care. He appeared to be thinking much of others, and little of himself. In 1820 he was known to have a sum of 630,000 francs lodged in his name with Laffitte, but before reserving these 630,000 francs, he had spent more than 1,000,000 for the town and its poor. The hospital was badly endowed. He founded 6 beds there. Montreuil-sur-Mer is divided into the upper and the lower town. The lower town, in which he lived, had but one school, a miserable hovel, which was falling to ruin. He constructed 2, one for girls, the other for boys. He allotted a salary from his own funds to the 2 instructors, a salary twice as large as their meagre official salary, and one day he said to someone who expressed surprise, "The 2 prime functionaries of the state are the nurse and the schoolmaster." He created at his own expense an infant school, a thing then almost unknown in France, and a fund for aiding old and infirm workmen. As his factory was a centre, a new quarter, in which there were a good many indigent families, rose rapidly around him. He established there a free dispensary. At first, when they watched his beginnings, the good souls said, "He's a jolly fellow who means to get rich." When they saw him enriching the country before he enriched himself, the good souls said, "He is an ambitious man." This seemed all the more probable since the man was religious, and even practiced his religion to a certain degree, a thing which was very favorably viewed at that epoch. He went regularly to low mass every Sunday. The local deputy, who nosed out all rivalry everywhere, soon began to grow uneasy over this religion. This deputy had been a member of the legislative body of the empire, and shared the religious ideas of a father of the Oratoire, known under the name of Fouché, Duc d'Otrante, whose creature and friend he had been. He indulged in gentle raillery at God with closed doors. But when he beheld the wealthy manufacturer Madeleine going to low mass at 7 o'clock, he perceived in him a possible candidate, and resolved to outdo him. He took a Jesuit confessor, and went to high mass and to vespers. Ambition was, at that time, in the direct acceptation of the word, a race to the steeple. The poor profited by this terror as well as the good God, for the honorable deputy also founded 2 beds in the hospital, which made 12. Nevertheless, in 1819, a rumor one morning circulated through the town to the effect that, on the representations of the prefect, and in consideration of the services rendered by him to the country, Father Madeleine was to be appointed by the king mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer. Those who had pronounced this newcomer to be an ambitious fellow seized with delight on this opportunity which all men desire, to exclaim, "There! What did we say?" All Montreuil-sur-Mer was in an uproar. The rumor was well founded. Several days later the appointment appeared in the Moniteur. On the following day Father Madeleine refused. In the same year of 1819 the products of the new process invented by Madeleine figured in the Industrial Exhibition. When the jury made their report, the king appointed the inventor a chevalier of the Legion of Honor. A fresh excitement in the little town. Well, so it was the cross that he wanted. Father Madeleine refused the cross. Decidedly this man was an enigma. The good souls got out of their predicament by saying, "After all, he is some sort of an adventurer." We have seen that the country owed much to him. The poor owed him everything. He was so useful and he was so gentle that the people had been obliged to honor and respect him. His workmen, in particular, adored him, and he endured this adoration with a sort of melancholy gravity. When he was known to be rich, people in society bowed to him, and he received invitations in the town. He was called, in town, Monsieur Madeleine. His workmen and the children continued to call him Father Madeleine, and that was what was most adapted to make him smile. In proportion as he mounted, throve, invitations rained down upon him. Society claimed him for its own. The prim little drawing-rooms on Montreuil-sur-Mer, which, of course, had at first been closed to the artisan, opened both leaves of their folding doors to the millionaire. They made 1,000 advances to him. He refused. This time the good gossips had no trouble. "He is an ignorant man, of no education. No one knows where he came from. He would not know how to behave in society. It has not been absolutely proved that he knows how to read." When they saw him making money, they said, "He's a man of business." When they saw him scattering his money about, they said, "He is an ambitious man." When he was seen to decline honors, they said, "He is an adventurer." When they saw him repulse society, they said, "He is a brute." In 1820, 5 years after his arrival in Montreuil-sur-Mer, the services which he had rendered to the district were so dazzling, the opinion of the whole country round about was so unanimous, that the king again appointed him mayor of the town. He again declined, but the prefect resisted his refusal. All the notabilities of the place came to implore him. The people in the street besought him. The urging was so vigorous that he ended by accepting. It was noticed that the thing which seemed chiefly to bring him to a decision was the almost irritated apostrophe addressed to him by an old woman of the people, who called to him from her threshold in an angry way, "A good mayor is a useful thing. Is he drawing back before the good which he can do?" This was the third phase of his ascent. Father Madeleine had become Monsieur Madeleine. Monsieur Madeleine had become Monsieur le Maire. End of chapter 2. Audiobooks.org. Recording by Joel Portinga. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 5, The Descent. Chapter 3, Sums Deposited with Laffitte. On the other hand, he remained as simple as on the first day. He had gray hair, a serious eye, the sunburned complexion of a laborer, the thoughtful visage of a philosopher. He habitually wore a hat with a wide brim, and a long coat of coarse cloth, buttoned to the chin. He fulfilled his duties as mayor, but, with that exception, he lived in solitude. He spoke to but few people. He avoided polite attentions. He escaped quickly. He smiled to relieve himself of the necessity of talking. He gave, in order to get rid of the necessity for smiling. The women said of him, "What a good-natured bear!" His pleasure consisted in strolling in the fields. He always took his meals alone, with an open book before him, which he read. He had a well-selected little library. He loved books. Books are cold but safe friends. In proportion as leisure came to him with fortune, he seemed to take advantage of it to cultivate his mind. It had been observed that, ever since his arrival at Montreuil-sur-Mer, his language had grown more polished, more choice, and more gentle with every passing year. He liked to carry a gun with him on his strolls, but he rarely made use of it. When he did happen to do so, his shooting was something so infallible as to inspire terror. He never killed an inoffensive animal. He never shot at a little bird. Although he was no longer young, it was thought that he was still prodigiously strong. He offered his assistance to anyone who was in need of it, lifted a horse, released a wheel clogged in the mud, or stopped a runaway bull by the horns. He always had his pocket full of money when he went out, but they were empty on his return. When he passed through a village, the ragged brats ran joyously after him, and surrounded him like a swarm of gnats. It was thought that he must, in the past, have lived a country life, since he knew all sorts of useful secrets, which he taught to the peasants. He taught them how to destroy scurf on wheat, by sprinkling it and the granary, and inundating the cracks in the floor with a solution of common salt, and how to chase away weevils by hanging up orviot in bloom everywhere, on the walls and the ceilings, among the grass and in the houses. He had recipes for exterminating from a field blight, tares, foxtail, and all parasitic growths which destroy the wheat. He defended a rabbit warren against rats simply by the odor of a guinea pig which he placed in it. One day he saw some country people busily engaged in pulling up nettles. He examined the plants, which were uprooted and already dried, and said, "They are dead. Nevertheless, it would be a good thing to know how to make use of them. When the nettle is young, the leaf makes an excellent vegetable. When it is older, it has filaments and fibers like hemp and flax. Nettle cloth is as good as linen cloth. Chopped up, nettles are good for poultry. Pounded, they are good for horned cattle. The seed of the nettle, mixed with fodder, gives gloss to the hair of the animals. The root, mixed with salt, produces a beautiful yellow coloring matter. Moreover, it is an excellent hay, which can be cut twice. And what is required for the nettle? A little soil, no care, no culture. Only the seed falls as it is ripe, and it is difficult to collect it. That is all. With the exercise of a little care, the nettle could be made useful. It is neglected, and it becomes hurtful. It is exterminated. How many men resemble the nettle?" He added after a pause, "Remember this, my friends. There are no such things as bad plants or bad men. There are only bad cultivators." The children loved him because he knew how to make charming little trifles of straw and coconuts. When he saw the door of a church hung in black, he entered. He sought out funerals as other men seek christenings. Widowhood and the grief of others attracted him, because of his great gentleness. He mingled with the friends clad in mourning, with families dressed in black, with the priests groaning around a coffin. He seemed to like to give to his thoughts for text these funereal psalmodies filled with a vision of the other world. With his eyes fixed on heaven, he listened with a sort of aspiration towards all the mysteries of the infinite, those sad voices which sing on the verge of the obscure abyss of death. He performed a multitude of good actions, concealing his agency in them as a man conceals himself because of evil actions. He penetrated houses privately, at night. He ascended staircases furtively. A poor wretch, on returning to his attic, would find that his door had been opened, sometimes even forced, during his absence. The poor man made a clamor over it. Some malefactor had been there. He entered, and the first thing he beheld was a piece of gold lying forgotten on some piece of furniture. The malefactor, who had been there, was Father Madeleine. He was affable and sad. The people said, "There is a rich man who has not a haughty air. There is a happy man who has not a contented air." Some people maintained that he was a mysterious person, and that no one ever entered his chamber, which was a regular anchorite cell, furnished with winged hour-glasses and enlivened by crossbones and skulls of dead men. This was much talked of, so that one of the elegant and malicious young women of Montreuil-sur-Mer came to him one day and asked, "Monsieur le Maire, pray show us your chamber. It is said to be a grotto." He smiled and introduced them instantly into this grotto. They were well punished for their curiosity. The room was very simply furnished in mahogany, which was rather ugly, like all furniture of that sort, and hung with paper worth 12 sous. They could see nothing remarkable about it, except 2 candlesticks of antique pattern which stood on the chimney-piece and appeared to be silver. For they were hall-marked, an observation full of the type of wit of petty towns. Nevertheless, people continued to say that no one ever got into the room, and that it was a hermit's cave, a mysterious retreat, a hole, a tomb. It was also whispered about that he had immense sums deposited with Laffitte, with this particular feature, that they were always at his immediate disposal, so that, it was added, Monsieur Madeleine could make his appearance at Laffitte's any morning, sign a receipt, and carry off his 2 or 3 millions in 10 minutes. In reality, these 2 or 3 millions were reducible, as we have said, to 630 or 40,000 francs. End of Book 5, Chapter 3. LibriVox.org. Recording by Joel Portinga. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 5, The Descent. Chapter 4, Madeleine in Mourning. At the beginning of 1820, the newspapers announced the death of Monsieur Myriel, Bishop of D, surnamed Monseigneur Bienvenu, who had died in the odor of sanctity at the age of 82. The Bishop of D, to supply here a detail which the papers omitted, had been blind for many years before his death, and content to be blind, as his sister was beside him. Let us remark, by the way, that to be blind and to be loved is, in fact, one of the most strangely exquisite forms of happiness upon this earth, where nothing is complete. To have continually at one side a woman, a daughter, a sister, a charming being, who is there because you need her and because she cannot do without you, to know that we are indispensable to a person who is necessary to us, to be able to incessantly measure one's affection by the amount of her presence which she bestows on us, and to say to ourselves, "Since she consecrates the whole of her time to me, it is because I possess the whole of her heart," to behold her thought in lieu of her face, to be able to verify the fidelity of one being amid the eclipse of the world, to regard the rustle of a gown as the sound of wings, to hear her come and go, retire, speak, return, sing, and to think that one is the center of these steps, of this speech, to manifest at each instant one's personal attraction, to feel oneself all the more powerful because of one's infirmity, to become in one's obscurity, and through one's obscurity, the star around which this angel gravitates. Few felicities equal this. The supreme happiness of life consists in the conviction that one is loved for one's own sake, let us say rather, loved in spite of one's self. This conviction the blind man possesses. To be served in distress is to be caressed. Does he lack anything? No. One does not lose the sight when one has love. And what love! A love wholly constituted of virtue. There is no blindness where there is certainty. Soul seeks soul, gropingly, and finds it. And this soul, found and tested, is a woman. A hand sustains you, it is hers. A mouth lightly touches your brow, it is her mouth. You hear a breath very near you, it is hers. To have everything of her, from her worship to her pity, never to be left, to have that sweet weakness aiding you, to lean upon that immovable reed, to touch Providence with one's hands, and to be able to take it in one's arms. God made tangible. What bliss! The heart, that obscure celestial flower, undergoes a mysterious blossoming. One would not exchange that shadow for all brightness. The angel soul is there, uninterruptedly there. If she departs, it is but to return again. She vanishes like a dream, and reappears like reality. One feels warmth approaching, and behold, she is there. One overflows with serenity, with gaiety, with ecstasy. One is a radiance amid the night. And there are 1,000 little cares. Nothings which are enormous in that void. The most ineffable accents of the feminine voice employed to lull you, and supplying the vanished universe to you. One is caressed with the soul. One sees nothing, but one feels that one is adored. It is a paradise of shadows. It was from this paradise that Monseigneur Welcome had passed to the other. The announcement of his death was reprinted by the local journal of Montreuil-sur-Mer. On the following day, Monsieur Madeleine appeared clad wholly in black, and with crepe on his hat. This mourning was noticed in the town, and commented on. It seemed to throw a light on Monsieur Madeleine's origin. It was concluded that some relationship existed between him and the venerable bishop. "He has gone into mourning for the Bishop of D—, said the drawing-rooms. This raised Monsieur Madeleine's credit greatly, and procured for him, instantly and at one blow, a certain consideration in that noble world of Montreuil-sur-Mer. The microscopic Faubourg Saint-Germain of the place meditated raising the quarantine against Monsieur Madeleine, the probable relative of a bishop. Monsieur Madeleine perceived the advancement which he had obtained by the more numerous courtesies of the old women and the more plentiful smiles of the young ones. One evening, a ruler in that petty great world, who was curious by right of seniority, ventured to ask him, "Monsieur le Maire is doubtless a cousin of the late Bishop of D—." He said, "No, madame." "But," resumed the dowager, "you are wearing mourning for him." He replied, "It is because I was a servant in his family in my youth." Another thing which was remarked was, that every time that he encountered in the town a young Savoyard who was roaming about the country and seeking chimneys to sweep, the mayor had him summoned, inquired his name, and gave him money. The little Savoyards told each other about it. A great many of them passed that way. End of Book 5, Chapter 2. Recording by Joel Portinga. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 5. The Descent. Chapter 5. Vague flashes on the horizon. Little by little, and in the course of time, all this opposition subsided. There had at first been exercised against Monsieur Madeleine, in virtue of a sort of law which all those who rise must submit to, blackening and calumnies. Then they grew to be nothing more than ill nature, then merely malicious remarks. Then even this entirely disappeared. Respect became complete, unanimous, cordial, and towards 1821 the moment arrived when the word Monsieur le Maire was pronounced at Montreuil-sur-Mer with almost the same accent as Monseigneur the Bishop had been pronounced in D—, in 1815. People came from a distance of 10 leagues around to consult Monsieur Madeleine. He put an end to differences, he prevented lawsuits, he reconciled enemies. Everyone took him for the judge, and with good reason. It seemed as though he had for a soul the book of the natural law. It was like an epidemic of veneration, which in the course of 6 or 7 years gradually took possession of the whole district. One single man in the town, in the arrondissement, absolutely escaped this contagion, and, whatever Father Madeleine did, remained his opponent as though a sort of incorruptible and imperturbable instinct kept him on the alert and uneasy. It seems, in fact, as though there existed in certain men a veritable bestial instinct, though pure and upright, like all instincts, which creates antipathies and sympathies, which fatally separates one nature from another nature, which does not hesitate, which feels no disquiet, which does not hold its peace, which never belies itself, clear in its obscurity, infallible, imperious, intractable, stubborn to all counsels of the intelligence and to all the dissolvents of reason, and which, in whatever manner destinies are arranged, secretly warns the man-dog of the presence of the man-cat, and the man-fox of the presence of the man-lion. It frequently happened that when Monsieur Madeleine was passing along a street, calm, affectionate, surrounded by the blessings of all, a man of lofty stature, clad in an iron-gray frock coat, armed with a heavy cane and wearing a battered hat, turned round abruptly behind him, and followed him with his eyes until he disappeared with folded arms and a slow shake of the head, and his upper lip raised in company with his lower to his nose, a sort of significant grimace which might be translated by, What is that man, after all? I certainly have seen him somewhere. In any case, I am not his dupe." This person, grave with a gravity which was almost menacing, was one of those men who, even when only seen by a rapid glimpse, arrest the spectator's attention. His name was Javert, and he belonged to the police. At Montreuil-sur-Mer, he exercised the unpleasant but useful functions of an inspector. He had not seen Madeleine's beginnings. Javert owed the post which he occupied to the protection of M. Chabouillet, the secretary of the Minister of State, Comte Anglais, then prefect of police at Paris. When Javert arrived at Montreuil-sur-Mer, the fortune of the great manufacturer was already made, and Father Madeleine had become Monsieur Madeleine. Certain police officers have a peculiar physiognomy, which is complicated with an air of baseness mingled with an air of authority. Javert possessed this physiognomy, minus the baseness. It is our conviction that if souls were visible to the eyes, we should be able to see distinctly that strange thing that each one individual of the human race corresponds to one of the species of the animal creation, and we could easily recognize this truth, hardly perceived by the thinker, that from the oyster to the eagle, from the pig to the tiger, all animals exist in man, and that each one of them is in a man, sometimes even several of them at a time. Animals are nothing else than the figures of our virtues and our vices, straying before our eyes, the visible phantoms of our souls. God shows them to us in order to induce us to reflect. Only since animals are mere shadows, God has not made them capable of education in the full sense of the word. What is the use? On the contrary, our souls being realities and having a goal which is appropriate to them, God has bestowed on them intelligence, that is to say, the possibility of education. Social education, when well done, can always draw from a soul, of whatever sort it may be, the utility which it contains. This, be it said, is of course from the restricted point of view of the terrestrial life which is apparent, and without prejudging the profound question of the anterior or ulterior personality of the beings which are not man. The visible I in no wise authorizes the thinker to deny the latent I. Having made this reservation, let us pass on. Now, if the reader will admit, for a moment with us, that in every man there is one of the animal species of creation, it will be easy for us to say that there was in police officer Javert. The peasants of the Asturias are convinced that in every litter of wolves there is one dog which is killed by the mother because, otherwise, as he grew up, he would devour the other little ones. Give to this dog son of a wolf a human face, and the result will be Javert. Javert had been born in prison, of a fortune-teller whose husband was in the galleys. As he grew up, he thought he was outside the pale of society, and he despaired of ever re-entering it. He observed that society unpardoningly excludes two classes of men, those who attack it and those who guard it. He had no choice except between these two classes. At the same time, he was conscious of an indescribable foundation of rigidity, regularity, and probity, complicated with an inexpressible hatred for the race of Bohemians whence he was sprung. He entered the police. He succeeded there. At 40 years of age, he was an inspector. During his youth, he had been employed in the convict establishments of the South. Before proceeding further, let us come to an understanding as to these words, human face, which we have just applied to Javert. The human face of Javert consisted of a flat nose with two deep nostrils, towards which enormous whiskers ascended on his cheeks. One felt ill at ease when he saw these two forests and these two caverns for the first time. When Javert laughed, and his laugh was rare and terrible, his thin lips parted and revealed to view not only his teeth, but his gums, and around his nose there formed a flattened and savage fold, as on the muzzle of a wild beast. Javert, serious, was a watchdog. When he laughed he was like a tiger. As for the rest, he had very little skull and a great deal of jaw. His hair concealed his forehead and fell over his eyebrows. Between his eyes there was a permanent central frown, like an imprint of wrath. His gaze was obscure, his mouth pursed up and terrible. his air that of ferocious command. This man was composed of two very simple and two very good sentiments, comparatively, but he rendered them almost bad by dint of exaggerating them: respect for authority, hatred of rebellion, and in his eyes, murder, robbery, all crimes are only forms of rebellion. He enveloped in a blind and profound faith everyone who had a function in the state, from the prime minister to the rural policeman. He covered with scorn, aversion, and disgust every one who had once crossed the legal threshold of evil. He was absolute, and admitted no exceptions. On the one hand, he said, "The functionary can make no mistake. The magistrate is never the wrong." On the other hand, he said, "These men are irremediably lost. Nothing good can come from them." He fully shared the opinion of those extreme minds which attribute to human law I know not what power of making, or, if the reader will have it so, of authenticating, demons, and who place a Styx at the base of society. He was stoical, serious, austere, a melancholy dreamer, humble and haughty, like fanatics. His glance was like a gimlet, cold and piercing. His whole life hung on these two words, watchfulness and supervision. He had introduced a straight line into what is the most crooked thing in the world. He possessed the conscience of his usefulness, the religion of his functions, and he was a spy as other men are priests. Woe to the man who fell into his hands! He would have arrested his own father if the latter had escaped from the galleys, and would have denounced his mother if she had broken her ban. And he would have done it with that sort of inward satisfaction which is conferred by virtue, and, withal, a life of privation, isolation, abnegation, chastity, with never a diversion. It was implacable duty. The police understood, as the Spartans understood Sparta, a pitiless lying in wait, a ferocious honesty, a marble informer, Brutus in Vidocq. Javert's whole person was expressive of the man who spies and who withdraws himself from observation. The mystical school of Joseph de Maistre, which at that epoch seasoned with lofty cosmogony those things which were called the ultra newspapers, would not have failed to declare that Javert was a symbol. His brow was not visible, it disappeared beneath his hat. His eyes were not visible, since they were lost under his eyebrows. His chin was not visible, for it was plunged in his cravat. His hands were not visible, they were drawn up in his sleeves. And his cane was not visible, he carried it under his coat. But when the occasion presented itself, there was suddenly seen to emerge from all this shadow, as from an ambuscade, a narrow and angular forehead, a baleful glance, a threatening chin, enormous hands, and a monstrous cudgel. In his leisure moments, which were far from frequent, he read, although he hated books. This caused him to be not wholly illiterate. This could be recognized by some emphasis in his speech. As we have said, he had no vices. When he was pleased with himself, he permitted himself a pinch of snuff. Therein lay his connection with humanity. The reader will have no difficulty in understanding that Javert was the terror of that whole class which the annual statistics of the Ministry of Justice designates under the rubric vagrants. The name of Javert routed them by its mere utterance. The face of Javert petrified them at sight. Such was this formidable man. Javert was like an eye constantly fixed on M. Madeleine, an eye full of suspicion and conjecture. M. Madeleine had finally perceived the fact, but it seemed to be of no importance to him. He did not even put a question to Javert. He neither sought nor avoided him. He bore that embarrassing and almost oppressive gaze without appearing to notice it. He treated Javert with ease and courtesy, as he did all the rest of the world. It was divined, from some words which escaped Javert, that he had secretly investigated, with that curiosity which belongs to the race, and into which there enters as much instinct as will, all the anterior traces which Father Madeleine might have left elsewhere. He seemed to know, and he sometimes said in covert words, that someone had gleaned certain information in a certain district about a family which had disappeared. Once he chanced to say, as he was talking to himself, "I think I have him." Then he remained pensive for 3 days, and uttered not a word. It seemed that the thread which he thought he held had broken. Moreover, and this furnishes the necessary corrective for the too absolute sense which certain words might present, there can be nothing really infallible in a human creature, and the peculiarity of instinct is that it can be confused, thrown off the track, and defeated. Otherwise it would be superior to intelligence, and the beast would be found to be provided with a better light than man. Javert was evidently somewhat disconcerted by the perfect naturalness and tranquillity of M. Madeleine. One day, nevertheless, his strange manner appeared to produce an impression on M. Madeleine. It was on the following occasion. End of chapter 5. Audiobooks.org. Recording by Joel Portinga. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 5. The Descent. Chapter 6. Father Fauchelevent. One morning, M. Madeleine was passing through an unpaved alley of Montreuil-sur-Mer. He heard a noise and saw a group some distance away. He approached. An old man named Father Fauchelevent had just fallen beneath his cart, his horse having tumbled down. This Fauchelevent was one of the few enemies whom M. Madeleine had at that time. When Madeleine arrived in the neighborhood, Fauchelevent, an ex-notary and a peasant who was almost educated, had a business which was beginning to be in a bad way. Fauchelevent had seen this simple workman grow rich, while he, a lawyer, was being ruined. This had filled him with jealousy, and he had done all he could, on every occasion, to injure Madeleine. Then bankruptcy had come, and as the old man had nothing left but a cart and a horse, and neither family nor children, he had turned carter. The horse had 2 broken legs and could not rise. The old man was caught in the wheels. The fall had been so unlucky that the whole weight of the vehicle rested on his breast. The cart was quite heavily laden. Father Fauchelevent was rattling in the throat in the most lamentable manner. They had tried, but in vain, to drag him out. An unmethodical effort, aid awkwardly given, a wrong shake might kill him. It was impossible to disengage him otherwise than by lifting the vehicle off of him. Javert, who had come up at the moment of the accident, had sent for a jack-screw. M. Madeleine arrived. People stood aside respectfully. "Help!" cried old Fauchelevent. "Who will be good and save the old man?" M. Madeleine turned towards those present. "Is there a jack-screw to be had?" "One has been sent for," answered the peasant. "How long will it take to get it?" "They have gone for the market, to Flachot's place, where there is a farrier, but it makes no difference. It will take a good quarter of an hour." "A quarter of an hour!" exclaimed Madeleine. It had rained on the preceding night. The soil was soaked. The cart was sinking deeper into the earth every moment, and crushing the old carter's breast more and more. It was evident that his ribs would be broken in 5 minutes more. "It is impossible to wait another quarter of an hour," said Madeleine to the peasants, who were staring at him. "We must." "But it will be too late then. Don't you see that the cart is sinking?" "Well?" "Listen," resumed Madeleine. "There is still room enough under the cart to allow a man to crawl beneath it and raise it with his back. Only half a minute, and the poor man can be taken out. Is there any one here who has stout loins and heart? There are 5 louis d'or to be earned." Not a man in the group stirred. 10 louis, said Madeleine. The persons present dropped their eyes. One of them muttered, "A man would need to be devilish strong, and then he runs the risk of getting crushed." "Come," began Madeleine again, 20 louis. The same silence. "It is not the will which is lacking," said a voice. M. Madeleine turned round, and recognized Javert. He had not noticed him on his arrival. Javert went on, "It is strength. One would have to be a terrible man to do such a thing as lift a cart like that on his back." Then, gazing fixedly at M. Madeleine, he went on, emphasizing every word that he uttered. "Monsieur Madeleine, I have never known but one man capable of doing what you ask." Madeleine shuddered. Javert added with an air of indifference, but without removing his eyes from Madeleine, He was a convict. "Ah," said Madeleine, "in the galleys at Toulon." Madeleine turned pale. Meanwhile the cart continued to sink slowly. Father Fauchelevent rattled in the throat and shrieked, "I'm strangling! My ribs are breaking! A screw! Something! Ah!" Madeleine glanced about him. "Is there, then, no one who wishes to earn 20 louis and save the life of this poor old man?" No one stirred. Javert resumed, "I have never known but one man who could take the place of a screw, and he was that convict." "Ah, it is crushing me!" cried the old man. Madeleine raised his head, met Javert's falcon eyes still fixed upon him, and looked at the motionless peasants, and smiled sadly. Then, without saying a word, he fell on his knees, and before the crowd had even time to utter a cry, he was underneath the vehicle. A terrible moment of expectation and silence ensued. They beheld Madeleine, almost flat on his stomach beneath that terrible weight, make 2 vain efforts to bring his knees and his elbows together. They shouted to him, "Father Madeleine, come out!" Old Fauchelevent himself said to him, "Monsieur Madeleine, go away. You see that I am fated to die. Leave me. You will get yourself crushed also." Madeleine made no reply. All the spectators were panting. The wheels had continued to sink, and it had become almost impossible for Madeleine to make his way from under the vehicle. Suddenly the enormous mass was seen to quiver. The cart rose slowly. The wheels half emerged from the ruts. They heard a stifled voice crying, "Make haste! Help!" It was Madeleine, who had just made a final effort. They rushed forwards. The devotion of a single man had given force and courage to all. The cart was raised by 20 arms. Old Fauchelevent was saved. Madeleine rose. He was pale, though dripping with perspiration. His clothes were torn and covered with mud. All wept. The old man kissed his knees and called him the good God. As for him, he bore upon his countenance an indescribable expression of happy and celestial suffering, and he fixed his tranquil eye on Javert, who was still staring at him. End of chapter 6.
To volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Eastman. Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Book 5, The Descent. Chapter 7. Fauchelevent becomes a gardener in Paris. Fauchelevent had dislocated his knee-pan in his fall. Father Madeleine had him conveyed to an infirmary, which he had established for his workmen in the factory building itself, and which was served by 2 sisters of charity. On the following morning, the old man found a 1,000-franc banknote on his nightstand, with these words in Father Madeleine's writing: "I purchase your horse and cart." The cart was broken, and the horse was dead. Fauchelevent recovered, but his knee remained stiff. Monsieur Madeleine, on the recommendation of the Sisters of Charity and of his priest, got the good man a place as gardener in a female convent in the Rue Saint-Antoine in Paris. Some time afterwards, Monsieur Madeleine was appointed mayor. The first time that Javert beheld Monsieur Madeleine clothed in the scarf which gave him authority over the town, he felt the sort of shudder which a watchdog might experience on smelling a wolf in his master's clothes. From that time forth, he avoided him as much as he possibly could. When the requirements of the service imperatively demanded it, and he could not do otherwise than meet the mayor, he addressed him with profound respect. This prosperity created at Montreuil-sur-Mer by Father Madeleine had, besides the visible signs which we have mentioned, another symptom which was none the less significant for not being visible. This never deceives. When the population suffers, when work is lacking, when there is no commerce, the taxpayer resists imposts through penury, he exhausts and oversteps his respite, and the state expends a great deal of money in the charges for compelling and collection. When work is abundant, when the country is rich and happy, the taxes are paid easily and cost the state nothing. It may be said that there is one infallible thermometer of the public misery and riches: the cost of collecting the taxes. In the course of 7 years, the expense of collecting the taxes had diminished 3/4 in the arrondissement of Montreuil-sur-Mer, and this led to this arrondissement being frequently cited from all the rest by Monsieur de Villèle, then Minister of Finance. Such was the condition of the country when Fantine returned thither. No one remembered her. Fortunately, the door of Monsieur Madeleine's factory was like the face of a friend. She presented herself there, and was admitted to the women's workroom. The trade was entirely new to Fantine. She could not be very skilful at it, and she therefore earned but little by her day's work. But it was sufficient. The problem was solved. She was earning her living. End of Book 5, Chapter 7.